All right, thanks. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nikki Suzani. I'm the chair of this year's Student Advisory Board. I'm so excited to have you all here, and I hope you're just as excited to listen to our final presentations. Before I begin my remarks, I would like to extend a special thank you to our honored guests today. So thank you to California State Senator Josh Becker, San Mateo County Supervisor Don Horsley, Mayor of Campbell Liz Gibbons, Mayor of Mountain View Ellen Kamai, Atherton Councilmember Rick DeGolia, Campbell Councilmember Susan Landry, Campbell Councilmember Sergio Lopez, Menlo Park Councilmember Ray Mueller, Menlo Park Councilmember Jen Wollison, San Jose Councilmember Pam Foley, Scotts Valley Councilmember Jim Reed, Mr. Michael Sanchez representing Senator Dave Cortez's office, Ms. Lucy Koo representing Assemblymember Evan Lowe's office, Ms. Sophia Brink representing Supervisor Dave Canepa's office, Ms. Sandy Runyon representing Supervisor Otto Lee's office, Professor Daniel Common, UC Berkeley nuclear expert, Matt Barnard, co-founder of Plenty, and Professor Seming Yang, Santa Clara Law School climate diplomacy expert. And of course, thank you to everyone else for coming today. We really, really appreciate it. So without further ado, I'll begin my remarks. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 2020 to 21 Student Advisory Board's final presentation night. Throughout the course of the night, each of our committees will be presenting a policy proposal relating to one of 14 key subgroups within the topic of climate change. We'll be exploring everything from carbon capture solutions to climate diplomacy. But what you won't see tonight is the work we took to get us here. Over the course of the semester, we, a group of over 80 student participants, met every other Wednesday from 5:30 to 7 over Zoom to ideate, research, and develop the best possible proposals. It wasn't easy, and I want to give a huge thank you to everyone that helped us along that process, whether that's Brennan, Nicholas, Baltazar, Justin, and all the other SU staff members who organized meetings and got incredible speakers, or all the amazing professors and CEOs who shared their expertise with our subgroup members. I also want to give a giant shout out to my team, my officer team of Tech Officer Hamza, Secretary Irene, and Vice Chair Akshay. Y'all were absolutely incredible this year, with Hamza setting up an entire Slack and spending hours teaching everyone how to use it, Irene taking notes on long speeches and helping us stay organized, and Akshay being the best right-hand man I could have asked for, helping to lead meetings, give reports, and keep everyone on track. This year was certainly a difficult one, as is expected with the first fully virtual year of SAB, but I'm so happy to have been a part of it, and I'm so thankful to everyone who made today possible. Now, I'm excited to introduce my Vice Chair Akshay, who will be presenting his remarks.
Thank you for those kind words, Nikki. Hi, everyone. I'm Akshay Manglik, Vice Chair of the Student Advisory Board. I hope you're having a good afternoon. To start off, I'd like to thank the staffers and other officers. To Nicholas, Brennan, Balthazar, and Justin, you've been invaluable resources and mentors for bringing these projects to fruition, and we couldn't have made it to this final meeting without you. To Nikki, Irene, and Hamza, you've been some of the smartest and most dedicated people I've had a chance to work with. Finally, I'd like to thank all of the board members. None of this would have been possible without your effort and your willingness to work through some of the most disruptive conditions we've had. And it's those conditions, COVID, assaults on our institutions, that demand civic engagement, that really demand the work we've been doing. Climate change is a unique issue because it affects every single aspect of modern life, which is what makes it so difficult to combat. But at the same time, that's what makes it an opportunity to look at systems, institutions, structures with new eyes, to change things that never could have been changed, to imagine and reimagine the future. Today, we'll see 14 of those visions, how we could reshape agriculture, change our refugee and asylum systems, and rethink public transportation, to name just a few. It's an inspiring testament to our work and to what the future can hold. Today isn't the end of our work, it's just the beginning. Thank you to you all for a great year of SAB, and I hope you enjoy the presentations.
Yeah, thank you, Akshay. Now it is my honor to introduce to you the Woman of the Hour, Congresswoman Anna Eshoo. Congresswoman Eshoo has been advocating for our district since 1992, when she was first elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. She is the first ever woman to be the chair of the Health Subcommittee and remains in that position today. And as a member of Congress, she has drafted part of the Affordable Care Act, improved the regulation of medical devices by the FDA, modernized the Caltrain transportation system, and promoted safe drinking water for American households, among many other accomplishments. Most importantly to me, as a woman with a Syrian and Armenian heritage, Congresswoman Eshoo serves as incredible representation for young Middle Eastern girls like me who have hopes of getting into politics one day too. With that, I present to you Congresswoman Anna Eshoo.
Thank you so much, Nikki, and good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Student Advisory Board of the 18th Congressional District's presentation. I want to thank the officers, starting with Nikki, Irene, Hamza, and Akshay. You've given great leadership to the board. And I want to salute the staffers from my office. Their names have already been mentioned. They've worked very hard right along with the students. And I don't think that Nikki is giving the students enough credit, because this has been a year like no other, we have experienced something that was a first for our nation. Amidst all of the challenges with the coronavirus, the students never threw the towel in. They kept meeting every single week. They stayed with the challenge that was before them. And I'm always exceedingly proud of the students. This year, even more so, because of the challenges, and I think they went above and beyond. What it says to me is what a commitment they had to their work, and certainly to this issue that is a challenge to the entire world. Just very quickly, for those of you that may not know, when I was first running for Congress, I wanted to hear what young people had to say. I mean, you meet with so many community groups and organizations and advocates, and everyone has, their wonderful agenda, and they want to question you, and you learn a great deal, from them, and then hopefully they got to know me. But amongst them were not high school students. And so I reached out to all of the high schools in the congressional district and invited students to come to the headquarters and meet with me. We had to do it in segments because there were so many, actually. And it wasn't to have them work in my campaign. I wanted to know what was important to them. And I think that we who are older know that that young people have a very clear vision of where they want to go, and are willing to map out a pathway in order to get there. I think the older we get, because of our experiences, we say yes, but they don't have any strings attached to them. And that's what I love, because their thinking is not encumbered by all the old stuff. So I made that commitment to the students then. And shortly after I was sworn in, we established the first student advisory board in early 1993. And so we have had hundreds, if not well over 1,000 students that have done this. And the first group said to me, tell us what you want us to do. And I said, no, it's the other way around. I'm putting you together so that you can tell me what you want me to do. And so over all of the years, they have done superb work. They have chosen the issue that they wanted to research. They have made recommendations. I've turned them into legislation, sponsored bills because of them, and written bills and advanced bills because of them. And I think that that's a real integration of their voices in the representation of the district. So this is the 28th year, and bravo, students. I also wanted to thank all of the elected officials and their representatives that are attending today. You honor the students and their work. And for that, I can't thank you enough. And for being such great partners of mine in service to our mutual constituents. So the program belongs to the students. They have it all mapped out. We know that it was a tough year. Thank goodness, thanks to the scientists and all of the people that have worked, certainly in local government, state government, community organizations, nonprofits, to help bring us through this. We're not completely out of the woods yet, but all of you are old enough to have been vaccinated, and I certainly hope you are. And I think, fingers crossed, by mid-fall, that young children will be able to be inoculated, vaccinated as well. So thank you. Thank you for your commitment. I look forward to I look forward to seeing the bright future that each one of you I know is going to have, because I've seen firsthand the commitment that you have. And I hope that I think this experience is one that's going to remain with you, for the rest of your lives. And I think that the kinds of recommendations and research that you've done really helps to provide a very important pathway forward for us to do the right things in Congress for our country, and that the United States of America will be the leader in really making a difference to this a global challenge of climate change. So thank you, Nikki. Thank you to all the officers. Thank you to every student, to the staff, and to the wonderful, beautiful guests and friends that have joined us. Welcome. Again, you honor the students and the work that they've done with your presence. So we're all set to listen to you. So take it away, Nikki.
Yeah, Hamza, if you want to share the presentations. Action.
Yep. So first off, we have the Environmental Racism Subcommittee, and the members that are presenting will be Sarah Lynn, Caroline Malat, Sonali Muthukrishnan, Irene Park, Victoria Revoloro, and Nikki Suzani.
Jump in. I forgot to mention something very important. Just one sentence, and that is to all of our guests and their families. I didn't thank their families, and I certainly didn't mean to overlook you, because you're so much a part of this, and your teachers. The students' report will be sent to the Library of Congress, where it will be cataloged. Now, that is the world's largest library in the world. So there will be many that will have access to the research and the recommendations that the students have made. And that's really a great source of pride to me, and I think it should be to all of you. So this is going to go directly to the Library of Congress, and bravo. And excuse me for interrupting, but I just had to get that in to thank the families and to let everyone know that that your work is going to the Library of Congress. It's the largest repository of knowledge in the world, and you're adding to it.
Well, with that, we have the Environmental Racism Subcommittee.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us. My name is Sonali Muthukrishnan, and I am the chair of the Environmental Racism Subcommittee this year. Next slide, please.
Make it louder.
Throughout this year, the subcommittee chose to focus on the Indigenous community and the pervasive issue that is toxic waste dumping. I'm now going to turn it over to Sarah to share more about our proposal.
Hi, so it's been proven, the next slide. It's been proven through the National Institutes of Health and the Environmental Protection Agency that climate change bears disproportionate effects on minorities. In particular, Indigenous communities are affected by toxic waste dumping by corporations, since they heavily rely on their land for basic resources, economic growth, and connections to their spiritual ancestors.
So throughout this presentation, you will hear our course of action, which involves 1, reforming the current EPA permit process risk assessment methodology, and 2, better monitoring the EPA's processes. So now I will hand it off to Nikki, who will talk about the legislative background of our proposal.
All right, before we get into our proposal specifics, we need to start with the path it'll take. Our proposal will go through the Subcommittee for Indigenous Peoples of the United States, which is chaired by Teresa Fernandez and includes California Congressman Alan Lowenthal, who the Congressman could work with directly to get the proposal passed. It's going to follow a similar path as the Save Oak Flat legislation, and an alternative to passing it through Congress would be to work directly with Secretary of the Interior Deb Haaland, who herself is Indigenous and is focused on environmental protection of land, to work with the EPA directly to get the permit process changed without needing a congressional bill or law. Next, I'm going to pass it off to Carly to talk about the specific proposal and solution.
So our first recommendation is to change the terminology and the requirements in the previous legislation regarding toxic waste proposal, as well as to adopt this convention from going forth. And my colleague Isha will now speak on our proposal with more depth.
Next slide, please. Next slide. Thank you. Tribes are independent entities for negotiation. The government is currently required to negotiate with tribes or the state, but not both. However, due to systemic racism, many tribes struggle financially and are much more inclined to take a settlement from the government. Thus, the government usually negotiates with tribes instead of states and takes advantage of them, dumping a disproportionate amount of waste on native lands, even when the land does not meet international safety standards for disposal, like in the case of the Yucca Mountain. It also causes conflict between the state and the tribe in cases where the state did not want the waste, such as with the Skull Valley Goshu tribe, once again unfairly targeting and exploiting indigenous tribes. Next slide, please. Our solution is to change this requirement from or to and, so that the government must negotiate with both the states and the indigenous tribes. This will allow for stricter regulations and environmental protections, as negotiations must also go through states and vice versa, and will ensure that waste is not disproportionately dumped on indigenous lands just because it's easier. I'd now like to introduce Sonali, who will be discussing the next part of our solution.
Okay, so step 2 of our proposal is reforming the legal permit process and enforcing EPA monitoring and oversight. For companies in the waste business, indigenous land is an easy area to conduct business within. In order to build a hazardous waste facility on a reservation, there exists a minimal permit process, public input and review, and also the added benefit of little to no government interference. In addition, only a few tribes currently have laws regarding the environment with limited enforcement mechanisms. This lack of protections leaves reservations more vulnerable to corporate interests that go against environmental ones. Next slide, please. In terms of the permit process, businesses hoping to build toxic waste facilities on tribal lands do not have to meet the requirements of the county or state permit processes. This lack of permit requirements allows companies to sidestep the vital environmental review associated with such processes. Next slide. Currently, the EPA's policy is to consult through government-to-government communication with federally recognized tribal governments in cases where the EPA's actions or decisions could affect tribal interests. Consultation is constantly adjusted to better communication. This policy attempts to make consultation with tribal governments a standard EPA practice, and it is not an additional requirement. Next slide, please. In terms of government oversight on hazardous waste facilities, every company creating a hazardous waste disposal facility on indigenous land must apply for an RCRA permit from the EPA. However, the EPA often approves all applications regardless of serious environmental concerns. In addition, the remote location of Indian reservations makes the situation worse because EPA inspectors can't frequently visit the locations to review the operations of these hazardous waste facilities. Now I'm going to turn it over to Irene to talk more about the reformation needed. Next slide, please.
Thank you. Now, looking at the systemic context of environmental equity for this group, we examined the EPA's existing risk and decision-making standard. This 1992 report excerpt shows how existing methodology is not entirely inclusive of cultural and religious impact that would more equitably assess risk in Indigenous communities. And so where are we now? The 1995 risk characterization policy tried to initiate this agency-wide culture change. However, analyzing countless web documents, we're directed to the most recent 189-page handbook, which spends just one page explicitly addressing these factors, to which it concludes, it is probably desirable that risk characterization applies not only to the scientific factor, but to all the factors in the way they do business. The statement is vague and non-binding, and we're left with unreliable insight into this process. Next slide, please. Thus, we suggest that sociological, cultural, and religious factors adjusted for Indigenous life are considered for a comparative risk assessment. This does not limit the EPA from grounding their decision-making in their science. It simply is an added constructive consideration of non-negligible factors. The EPA actually conducted their own project across 11 Wisconsin tribes, adapting the methodology used for evidence to tribal conditions such as subsistence lifestyles, and it confirmed that risks on reservations are vastly different and that a more inclusive methodology enhanced their ability to more accurately identify risk. All that's left is to create the system and establish it in their decision-making standards and ensure that proper administrative oversight can cultivate stronger evidence for risk management decisions. And I'll pass it to Sonali for the conclusion.
In conclusion, the Indigenous community is heavily impacted by toxic waste dumping on their sacred tribal lands because they use this land as a resource for their way of life. In addition to our proposal, we also hope the EPA takes the value of public input and opinion more seriously. Our proposal will change our country by helping create the protection that the Indigenous community needs against corporations in toxic waste situations. However, the work addressing environmental justice is just beginning, and it must continue. Thank you.
Congressman Escher, do you have any questions, or should I move on to the next subcommittee?
Well, I just wanted to make a comment, and that is that the new secretary in the president's cabinet of the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, that agency was practically dismembered by the last administration. So they're in the process of rebuilding the, all the professionals and everyone there. But very importantly, the secretary, the head of the EPA now, is former Congresswoman Deb Haaland, and she is a Native American. She and another woman were the first Native Americans to ever serve in the history of the Congress, and so she is both a visionary and she also knows the subject matter inside and out. So I'm going to get this particular presentation to her, but I think for each one of you and the work you've done, I think you're going to see some marvelous things coming, taking place as a result of her leadership. She really is superb. She is superb, and she knows these issues backward and forward. And she is, well, you can tell by the way she was questioned by some during her confirmation hearings. Those that don't have too much use for the EPA gave her a bad time. So that was a backhanded compliment to her. So I just wanted to make that observation to you. She's an important leader.
Yeah, she's really incredible. We actually researched her when we were thinking about all of this. So it's really great to see that come full circle.
It is. It's very exciting.
Nikki and Representative Escher, if I could add one thing to this as well.
Sure.
And that is, there's another powerful woman Native American leader who just took a position in the Biden administration, and she's from Oakland and Arizona. And you might want to add to that list. Wahala Johns from the Blackwater tribe, from the Blackwater clan of the Navajo,
And
who
where
lives
is
half-time in Oakland, half-time in
what's
Arizona.
the position? What's the
She
position?
is, well, it's changing as we speak, but she was appointed to be the advisor to the Native to the Native American Energy Office of the Department of Energy, but her appointment is now being upgraded to be the director of that office.
I see.
And actually,
Well,
she
thank
just
you.
had, yeah, she's literally moving to DC this weekend as a result. But
Well, that's
you might
that's
want
really
to
wonderful.
CC a
Yes,
copy of this to both of them because they will work
absolutely.
very
We will
closely
do that.
together.
We will do that. Thank you for, I was not aware of that.
It's new. I was at the celebration event yesterday in downtown Oakland, so
Isn't
it's
that
very
great?
new.
Isn't that great? Isn't that great?
And I'll put her link in the chat so you have
great,
a
wonderful. We all thank you for that. Well, I'll make sure that she gets it. Terrific.
Thanks, Hamza. All right. Next, I will introduce the Healthcare Impact Subcommittee with members Philip Gu, Sahil Sundarasan, Tara Sabet, Claire Oslander, Savannah Prasad, and Christine Pashin.
I was muted, sorry. Hello, everybody, and thank you all for being here. I am Tara Savet, and I'm honored to have been the chair for the Healthcare Impact Subcommittee this past year. Our subcommittee has chosen to focus on how global warming, in the specific form of heat stroke and wildfires, has affected our national healthcare. From our three-step proposal strategy to our policy responses, we will outline our recommended structures to both better our national healthcare systems and improve actions towards environmental care.
So global warming is a longstanding issue that has numerous adverse impacts on the US climate as well as public health. And land regions across the globe have seen an increased incidence in heat stroke, cardiac arrest, and other health issues. Much of the Western continental United States has also struggled to respond to these record-setting issues with a multitude of disastrous health impacts, such as bronchitis, worsening COPD, and asthma, and others. And as outlined by this diagram from the CDC's National Climate Assessment Health Chapter, environmental issues not limited, including but not limited to extreme heat, water quality impacts, and air pollution all have effects on overall human health. So our subcommittee will be discussing the effects of extreme heat. Next slide, please. So the climate emergency is well established in California and in Congresswoman Eshu's district. In 2018, we witnessed one of the most destructive wildfires in the state history, which burned nearly 2 million acres. And more recently, the CZU Lightning Complex fire impacted many constituents in our district, and is yet another example of why we should be prepared to respond to these severe weather events as their incidence and severity continues to increase. Next slide, please. Thank you. The impacts of a heating environment on healthcare are derived from heat strokes and wildfires. Extreme heat contributes towards heat exhaustion, heat strokes, along with exacerbating pre-existing chronic conditions. And wildfires mainly have respiratory effects, such as severe impacts on asthma, COPD, bronchitis, and other lung diseases. This environmental issue also increases the risk of cardiac arrest, stroke, and blood clots, in addition to worsening heart failure and pulmonary emboli. With the apparent medical harms from the environment, the implementation of new systems, such as heat detection systems, along with public health surveillance and response teams, is imperative. Without composing and enacting a comprehensive policy response that addresses all of these anticipated impacts, the United States and our district will suffer from extreme health consequences. Thank you. And next slide, please.
Now that we have briefly introduced some context to the relations between the environment and healthcare, we will now move on to our proposed response and outcomes. We will address our proposal strategy, apply it to our two main environmental issues, and then introduce our recommendations for the short and long term. So next slide, please. Our proposal employs a three-section strategy: awareness, prevention, and implementation, to outline solutions against heat stroke and wildfires. These mitigations offer and recommend plausible solutions which execute necessary actions for environmental control, including but not limited to preserving resources for healthcare and remote work during environmental emergencies, reinforcing healthcare protocols, and technological management of medical issues and the environmental state. We would recommend that Congress would enact these ideas in part of a larger bill dealing with wildfires and resiliency to address the health effects of global warming. Next slide, please.
Our proposal strategy was directly applied to our two main environmental issues, the first being heat waves. When it comes to awareness, our subcommittee suggests spreading awareness of heat-related health outcomes, such as heat exhaustion, heat cramps, and heat stroke. For prevention, we recommend identifying high-risk populations, which include vulnerable communities and urban areas, also identifying environmental risk factors, and evaluating the effectiveness of measures put in place. However, awareness and prevention serve no purpose without the implementation of adaptive structures, which is why we recommend data mapping systems, reporting systems that monitor mortality and illness, meteorologists specifically focus on heatwave prediction, strengthening healthcare protocols already in place, and reserving resources in the event of extreme heat. Next slide, please. We also applied the same three-step strategy to wildfires as well. For awareness and prevention, we suggest identifying regions and groups most susceptible to wildfires, educating students and respective families on smoke safety, and expanding on legislation about wildfires. For implementation, we recommend supplying safe houses with resources in at-risk areas, implementing smoke days depending on air quality index level, which we will discuss momentarily, providing institutions with resources for remote instruction in the event of a smoke day, supplying PPE resources, screening people for pulmonary and respiratory issues, and dedicating public schools for pyrotechnic activities similar to how fires are prohibited and permitted at certain beaches. Next slide, please.
When the air quality index reaches 100, sensitive groups should have the option to work or attend school remotely without penalization. School district superintendents must notify families of this option, and workplace human resources departments must notify employees of this option as well. When the air quality index reaches 150, smoke days should be allotted to students, teachers, and other staff members. Districts should be provided with appropriate resources in order to prepare for remote instruction, especially for schools under Title I funding and workplaces. Next slide, please. Those with pulmonary and respiratory issues are also at higher risk for adverse health events during wildfires. In order to identify pulmonary diseases, primary school students should be screened for common chronic respiratory conditions, in addition to hearing and vision tests during annual school health screenings. Secondary school students should be screened for respiratory and cardiovascular conditions at once during their high school tenure, preferably during 9th or 10th grade in physical education classes. Next slide, please.
Another factor to consider with regards to heat wave prevention are the people involved. Short-term planning policy would safeguard the acute effects of heat waves on people's health by establishing early warning systems and greater capacity for urban cooling centers. Our proposed policy response is a system of paratransit vans organized through the US Transportation Network, which can be added as an addendum to the upcoming Congress transportation bill. Although it is hard for people to get these designated locations, especially in the context of redlining, they can be relocated to areas near these transportation networks. As those who use public transportation utilize these networks on a daily and weekly basis, the system will prove to be efficient, accessible, and useful. Next slide, please.
Regarding the long-term heatwave prevention timeline, many cities and counties are taking action to implement policy to stop heat waves. However, extreme heat events such as heat islands still continue to trigger a variety of heat stress conditions. As a category of natural disasters, many heatwave-directed policies address health and climate equity concerns. For example, Cool Neighborhoods New York City builds upon existing programs like the New York City Cool Roofs program, which offers free cool roof coatings for materials and labor to increase housing affordability and support shelters and nonprofits, all to improve public health and equity. We propose to expand policy programs like Cool Neighborhoods New York City in different cities to develop digital infrastructure that can create community networks complementary to the physical ones utilized in the aforementioned program. Especially during COVID-19, wealth and social disparities in our society have greatly increased, and continuing to establish shared support systems to check on at-risk individuals during heat waves is imperative. Next slide, please.
Call to action. Climate action and healthcare reform were some of the most urgent concerns for voters in the recent 2020 presidential race. However, the policy to address the impacts of climate change on healthcare should be implemented on the federal level in order to eliminate disparities between individual states and corporations. The policy goals outlined above may appear costly to taxpayers in the short term, but will be well worth to US citizens in the following years. Health professionals and Americans have already begun to witness the devastating impacts of climate disasters, which are becoming more and more frequent on our health. Clear, bold action is urgently needed in order to address the risk that climate change poses on our nation's healthcare infrastructure, not only in the present, but in the future as well. Thank you.
Congresswoman Eshoo, do you have any questions for the?
Oh, I'm sorry. No, that was an excellent presentation, and I would just say on your call to action that the Congress is right now considering a massive infrastructure legislation, and so in addition to what is traditionally in infrastructure legislation, roads, bridges, ports, highways, there would be all new fleets of buses, with and of course all green technologies. But there also is a section in the legislation, some of it mine, relative to what needs to be addressed in order to prevent fires, but also to be able to address the challenges when they happen, when they occur. My legislation is around smoke and the health impacts. Do I need to remind everyone of that day during the coronavirus when you didn't know it was daytime? I mean, it's the eeriest thing I have ever seen, to look out my windows and it was as dark as night during the middle of the day. And that smoke and, I mean, it was, people were being warned. Close your windows. Do not go out under any circumstances. Do not breathe the air. So there is much to do to prepare our schools, our homes and neighborhoods, and so that's all part of the infrastructure bill, and it really needs to be done. So I'm just hoping that our Republican friends, colleagues will come along, because these are, as you have called out here, these are all issues that there has to be a call to action and action taken, because these are direct health threats for children, for teachers, our school buildings, our public buildings, and as well as other parts of this. I think I shouldn't say I'm happy. I'm thank you for pointing out that the CZU fire had a big impact on the southern part of our congressional district. We had 77,000 evacuees, 77,000, and over 1,000 homes lost just in our congressional district, in the southern end of it. So, it takes a great deal to help people put their lives back together after these tremendous losses. And now we're back in a drought. So I could go on and on about what you said, but I better stop so that you can go on with your presentation. But many of the things that you're calling for are in that legislation. That's the main point. So fingers crossed.
Well, next up we have the Solar Power Subcommittee, and the members that will be presenting are Annika Abdella, Eli Chain, Justin Gubbins, Jason DeHaaf, Caroline Ko, and Violet Melcher.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Congresswoman Eshoo, members of the Student Advisory Board, all of our guests today. I'm Jason. I'm going to be talking alongside my colleagues in the Solar Committee about solar energy, and specifically solar energy in schools. So let's go ahead on to the next slide now. I'm going to start out with a little context on the issue itself. To understand this issue, it's really important that we have a background on climate change, on energy, and on solar energy. All right. So the origins of global warming are very important in the discussion of energy. So I think this is pretty common knowledge, but we're going to go ahead and go over it anyway. Global warming really took off with the Industrial Revolution because the Industrial Revolution fomented increased demand for energy. That increased demand was filled by the burning of fossil fuels, which are just horrible for the environment and caused the poor state of environment that we're in now. So ever since the Industrial Revolution took off a long, long time ago in the 1800s, the demand for energy has increased. Now, luckily today, there are other ways to fill that demand, other ways which we will get to later on in this presentation. But for a little more context, I'm going to hand it off to my colleague, Justin, who will continue on with this background.
So originally, greenhouse gases weren't really considered a great threat to our planet, but since then, our view on the release of greenhouse gases
Jar there,
has
cashews
changed.
and something or other.
The greenhouse effect was first discovered by Joseph Fourier in 1824. Soon after, the scientists discovered that increasing amounts of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere increases global warming. Now we see this as an existential threat. According to NASA, some future effects of climate change in the United States include rising temperatures, changing precipitation patterns, droughts, stronger heat waves, more intense hurricanes, and rising sea levels. More specifically, the eastern and Midwest regions of the United States are threatened by extreme heat, heavy rain, and flooding, while the western regions are threatened by droughts, insect outbreaks, and reduced agricultural yields. Global warming and climate change threaten to reduce living standards and have a major effect on the American people if no action is taken. Now passing it on to Caroline.
So this slide will be about opportunity in solar energy. One of the most promising modern sources of energy is solar energy. Some of the potential benefits of solar energy that go unused by the American people are the constant provision of clean energy while also protecting Earth's climate, land, and wildlife. Installing solar panels would help schools save millions of dollars on electricity bills in the years to come. Though the initial installation cost would be relatively high, the use of solar energy would provide more financial security to schools, reducing their costs and helping them close their funding gap. Now Violet will be discussing the advantages of solar.
So what are the advantages of solar power? Not only is solar inexpensive, but it also does not pose any serious threats to the environment or surrounding communities. Additionally, solar power can be installed on existing structures. It's both efficient and relatively simple. Now my colleague Eli will present our proposal.
All right, so our proposal is called the School Solar Plan. The School Solar Plan would require $2 billion. This money would be distributed across the nation to both study the impacts of installing solar facilities at schools, but also to help school districts across the nation transition away from fossil fuels. This piece of legislation would pose the potential for public-private partnerships in terms of construction. And we also look at this piece of legislation not just as environmental reform, but as educational reform, because our legislation would allow schools to generate extra income, since in certain areas of the nation, schools could sell energy back to the electric grid, and that may help them deal with their budget issues. Our legislation also would allow schools with high energy costs to reduce their energy costs. And most importantly, it would help both schools and our nation fight against climate change. My colleague Annika will now talk about the legislative background around this.
Okay, so we believe that the committee that this would need to pass through would be the House Committee on Education and Labor, and more specifically the Subcommittee on Early Childhood, Elementary, and Secondary Education. Despite this being an energy bill, we find that it would be better to start it in the Education and Labor Committee because it poses an entire goal of the bill would be to save schools money themselves. So in this way, we'd be allocating more funds for education later down the line. In addition to that, the chair of the Subcommittee on Early Childhood, Elementary, and Secondary Education, Representative Sablon, has been very interested in the idea of developing alternative energy measures for schools. And while Burgess Owens, who is the ranking member on that subcommittee, has not been in support of federal funding for education, we do believe that he would be able to see the benefits to a bill like this and that it would be able to make it through the committee pretty rapidly. Next slide, please. Okay, so the popularity for solar in schools is incredibly high. In Virginia, they passed a bill called the Public School Buildings and Facilities Modernization, in which Virginia allocated more funding to modernize schools. And a large part of that was giving solar panels to school districts and then letting them sell the additional energy back to the grid. The bill passed 99-0 in that state house. So it's very evident that this is, a very bipartisan friendly piece of legislation. In Pittsburgh, California, a school district passed this exact measure, whereas they put solar panels on schools. They spent $18.5 million, but they're going to save $28 million over the course of 30 years, and they're going to offset 10 million gallons of gasoline. The project will pay for itself in 12 years, and after 12 years, the money that they're saving on their electricity bills, they'll be able to reinvest in their school district. So not only will we be fighting against climate change, but this piece of legislation would greatly increase the funds for education. In addition, solar as a concept is very popular in our country. The US Department of Energy has stated that it is not only becoming more increasingly popular, but more efficient and easy to come into contact with and access. And 77% of adults support that. So next slide, please. So we believe that the best method to pass this policy would be as an amendment to existing legislation, either on the American Families Plan, the American Jobs Plan, or the Green New Deal. The Green New Deal because of the environmental aspect. We believe that the American Jobs Plan would also be a really great way because this is an infrastructure piece of legislation, and that's what that bill targets, and kind of a similar idea with the American Families Plan. And I'm going to hand it back to my colleague Eli to explain the last piece of our presentation.
Yeah, Congresswoman, one piece of legislation we wanted to bring to your attention that is very similar to what we are proposing today is the Renew America's School Act of 2021, which was recently introduced by Senator Catherine Cortez Masto of Nevada. This bill has bipartisan co-sponsors with Senator Martin Heinrich of New Mexico, Debbie Stabenow of Michigan, Jeff Merkley of Oregon, Mazie Hirono of Hawaii, and two Republicans, Senator Lisa Murkowski of Alaska and Susan Collins of Maine, supporting it. I'm going to quote from the bill, but this piece of legislation is a bill to require the Secretary of Energy to provide grants for energy efficiency improvements and renewable energy improvements at public school facilities and for other purposes. So Congresswoman, if this piece of legislation makes it over the House, we hope that you will vote yes.
Is there a companion bill in the House for S694?
I don't believe so.
Okay. Well, we should look to see if someone, to double check that, A, and B, where you talked about the under solar power for bills that can be amended. First of all, neither the infrastructure bill or the American Families Plan. The infrastructure bill is really the American Jobs Act. That's what it's called. The other is the American Families Act. Those are still in the process of being drafted. They haven't even been introduced. So there's a big opportunity there. And as far as the Green Deal is concerned, that's not legislation. There's a misunderstanding about it. It's an aspirational statement. It's up to the Congress to take that aspirational statement and hammer it into legislative language. But it never was a bill, and it still isn't. And I think that that's important for everybody to know. I love the idea of how we can accomplish. Are there any other pilots or school districts in the Bay Area that have installed solar and are already on the bandwagon?
There are. This is Dan Cameron. I was going to highlight that California is actually the national leader in solar schools, and it's been paid for largely out of the revenues from our cap and trade program. It's been hugely successful, and the Pittsburgh example, I actually visited a few weeks ago, is a great case because they not only did solar initially, but to now power the school buses, they're using their excess solar to charge up electric school buses. And so there's a big energy benefit, but there's also a huge social and racial justice benefit because schools are consistently, as you students probably know, are consistently too hot in the summer and too cold in the winter. And so they use backup generators in the parking lot, which you can both hear, but also they put pollution right next to school kids, the most easily affected by pollution. And so there's an even better benefit than selling power back, and that's making our kids healthier. And so I really commend you for targeting this first at education, but I think that just the way the Congresswoman said, this is really a great opportunity to inject it as a first line item for the Jobs Act, because it hits so many of these critical points, from education to deploying solar, decarbonization, to also racial and social justice.
Thank you, Dan, a wonderful contributor to the conversation.
All right. Next up, we have the Nuclear Power Subcommittee with members Jonah Thomas, Siddharth Nair, Sohrab Durradian, Elise Boilisbach, Giorgio Mavica, and Sarah Gorbani. Apologies if I butchered names.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Elise Boilisbach, and I have had the honor of being the chair of the Nuclear Energy Subcommittee. I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to Sarah to get us started.
Hello, everyone. So you may be wondering, why should we implement nuclear? Nuclear energy is one of the most efficient sources of energy available in the United States. In 2016, nuclear power plants operated 336 out of the 365 days per year with an average capacity factor of 92.3%. Meanwhile, the hydroelectric systems, wind turbines, and solar electricity arrays delivered power 25 to 38% of the time. Nuclear power is more reliable and suitable for our country's large electricity needs. Nuclear energy is also better for our atmosphere. An average nuclear power reactor produces 1 gigawatt of electricity, but you would need almost 2 coal or 3 to 4 renewable plants to generate the same amount of electricity. With less work, we receive a greater amount of electricity, ultimately helping our environment. In addition, every year, nuclear generated electricity saves our atmosphere from more than 506 million metric tons of carbon dioxide emissions that would otherwise come from fossil fuels, which is equivalent to taking all the United States' 110 million passenger vehicles off the road. And next slide, please.
So the problem we're currently facing is what to do with nuclear waste, as nuclear has already been identified as a clean energy source. One solution that has been explored is the recycling of spent nuclear fuel rods. France, one of the leaders in nuclear power, recycles their spent nuclear fuel rods, and they're able to effectively use nuclear power with about 70% of their country's electricity coming from this source. So we know it is a viable option. These spent nuclear fuel rods continue to keep 90% of their potential energy even after being in a reactor for 5 years. Next slide. The US produces about 2,000 tons of nuclear waste per year and 83,000 tons since the 1950s. This sounds like a lot, but due to the density of nuclear waste, it could all fit on a football field with a depth of less than 10 yards. This fuel is stored at 70 sites across the US, and in the last 55 years, there has been no harm to people or the environment with transporting spent fuel. Next slide. Now on to the legislative history.
So a brief overview of the laws concerning nuclear waste energy. There are currently 4 main laws. However, I will cover the two most important. Next slide, please. So the Nuclear Waste Act of 1982, this law establishes the federal government's responsibility to provide a place for the permanent disposal of high-level radioactive waste and spent nuclear fuel. And amendments through this act have focused their efforts of the Department of Energy in the deposit site in the Yucca Mountains. Next slide, please. Law I will be talking about is the Low-Level Radioactive Waste Policy Amendments Act of 1985. This act gives states the responsibility to dispose of low-level radioactive waste. This act also requires the NRC to establish standards for determining when radionuclides are present in waste streams and insufficiently low concentrations or quantities as to be below regulatory concern. Next slide. So when looking at an international scale for laws concerning nuclear waste and energy, we see France as a large leader in nuclear energy and laws concerning nuclear energy and waste. Specifically, the 6 Program Act on the Sustainable Management of Radioactive Materials and Waste. This act was meant to draw up a balance on existing management measures of radioactive materials and waste, to make inventory on foreseeable needs for storage and waste disposal, to indicate the necessary capacities for such installations and the storage and the duration of the storage. We see laws like this being very useful for the French government, as they have regulated systems and bodies of government which allow them to accommodate their needs for the present and future of their nuclear energy and waste. Pass it to Elise for the solution.
So our solution is based heavily in the budget. Go ahead to the next slide and the next one. The Department of Energy received $38 billion per the 2020 fiscal year enacted budget, $26.9 billion of which went to nuclear related spending, and of that $1.4 billion to nuclear R&D. Based on these numbers, it is clear that nuclear energy is receiving plenty of spending. The question is how it's being spent, as only $55 million of those R&D dollars were spent in advanced reactor technologies, which is a 50% decrease from the 2019 enacted budget. Next slide, please. This matters because the Advanced Reactor Technologies Fund has targeted spending on promising technology of the future. It involves crucial early designs and developments of components and materials that are critical to the future of nuclear. Additionally, it houses the Generation 4 International Forum, which is an international collaboration that was founded in 2000 with the hope of having 6 future-oriented technologies operational and feasible by the year 2030. Next slide, please. After speaking with professors from both Berkeley and MIT have agreed that legislation is key to a success of a technology like nuclear. Next slide. So the plan has to do with moving money. The cross-cutting budget, which is similar to the ART, however, it is more restricted, has quite a bit of funding. And as such, we suggest moving $10 million from the cross-cutting budget to the ART budget. Next slide, please. Additionally, the Transformational Challenge Reactor section of the budget seeks to modernize nuclear reactors through 3D printing, thereby speeding up the production process of a nuclear reactor. However, without proper designs that are future-oriented and ready to take on the challenge of climate change, Speeding up reactor production is futile. As such, we suggest moving $10 million from the Transformational Challenge Reactor to the ART budget. Next, I will hand it off to my colleague Sid to talk about the technology.
Thanks, Elise. So looking at technology, the first thing that we could expect to be funded by the Office of Advanced Reactor Technologies is the next generation nuclear plant. So this plant makes use of gas cooling technology. It's far cheaper and safer than conventional nuclear reactors, and it's environmentally safe. It would involve the private sector in development through operation costs and development costs, so it would be far cheaper to produce as well. If you could give me the next slide, please. Thank you. So we could also look at small modular reactor technologies, such as the molten salt reactor, which employs molten salt as a coolant. So this is far safer. It's low pressure, like typical reactors are 75 to 150 times the atmospheric pressure of the Earth. Molten salt reactors are relatively similar to the atmospheric pressure. Molten salt reactors are less costly, and in addition to next generation nuclear plants, they're environmentally conscious as well. Next, I'm going to hand it off to Jonah for the opposition.
Thanks, Sid. The main points of opposition to nuclear energy are nuclear proliferation, accidents, public perception, and waste. With my limited time, I will focus on the concern of waste, which we hope to address in our proposal. The US has yet to decide upon a permanent solution to the spent nuclear fuel problem. States realize the potential harm it could cause to the environment and communities around holding sites due to prolonged radiation and do not often come up with agreements in legislation, as can be seen in the Yucca Mountain example. This issue could be greatly lessened with the investment and development of new reactor technologies, with reduced waste or even potential closed fuel cycles, all while being more efficient and safe. If this new technology were to be paired with a legislative agreement on permanent storage facility, the problem could potentially be completely solved. Now on to the conclusion.
Thanks, Jonah. Ultimately, passing this proposal would reduce carbon emissions greatly and allow the United States to use safe and reliable nuclear energy technologies for years to come. Eventually, in the distant future, this issue would have to be revisited upon the realization of nuclear fusion, but until then, increased funding to the Office of Advanced Reactor Technologies would allow efficient nuclear reactors, environmentally conscious nuclear reactors as well as a transition. Thank you.
Do I get to say something now? Am I unmuted?
No, you're.
I'm unmuted?
Yeah.
I just wanted to, a couple of things. The gentleman that has added a wonderful thinking so far, in addition to the students, we're really privileged to have him with us today, and he worked with the students. He's a professor at University of California at Berkeley, Dan Kamen, and professor of energy. So you probably already guessed that, but Dan, thank you for all the work that you've done with the students and for being with us today. On when you list opposition to nuclear power, you know, I know this and understand it very well. The whole issue of Yucca Mountain and the transfer, the dumping, or the burying of the spent nuclear wastes has been fought for years by the state of Nevada. And it's intense. It's intense. Now, I don't know which one of the students and your families would just raise your hands and say, bring the nuclear waste here. Are any of you comfortable bringing that nuclear waste to Palo Alto, Menlo Park, Portola Valley, San Jose? I don't think so. And there you have it. There you have it. Now, I have voted for research for all of the above. I have to say that I think clean coal is an oxymoron, but on nuclear energy, it does represent opportunities in terms of you know, a source of energy, but it is the nuclear waste that presents really, I mean, it really is such a problem, and it's something that we do not know how to change at this point. I understand that France, 70%, I think, reliant on nuclear power. But I would say, unless and until there is a way to break down the spent fuel rods and what they represent in terms of waste that doesn't break down for what, thousands of years. I don't see nuclear power advancing in our country. On these molten salt reactors, is that something that is already being used, or it's in the process of being developed? I'm not familiar with
They
that.
are in development.
In development. Okay, thank you. But I'm very glad that you included nuclear power, because if you didn't, with legitimacy, there would be someone that would critique and say, you really didn't speak to all of the options. So good for you for doing it.
So next up, we have the Natural Gas Subcommittee, and the members who will be presenting are Jamie Minden, Lupita Diaz, Charlotte Gunian, and Kit Walker.
Our proposal, the Methane Mitigation Act, includes a national REACH code banning the use of natural gas in all new developments created in the United States in order to decrease reliance on natural gas in the U.S. Additionally, the Methane Mitigation Act would serve to decrease methane emission levels by eliminating leakage of natural gas during the extraction and transportation as much as possible. Next, please. Background. Next. Natural gas is often presented to the public as a cleaner alternative to coal or oil. However, the primary component of natural gas, methane, is actually 34 times more potent than carbon dioxide in trapping heat over a period of 100 years and 86 times stronger in a 20-year period. Next. An average of 30 to 40% of natural gas is leaked as it is transported from fracking sites to the burn sites. These leakages account for up to 9% of total life cycle emissions. Studies show that methane leakages must be kept lower than 3.2% in order for natural gas power plants to have a lower life cycle emissions than coal plants. Next. Increased exposure to these leaked chemicals can result in cancer, respiratory system issues, and cardiovascular disease. Next. Fracking leads to contaminated water wells. Groundwater and surface water are also at risk of being contaminated from these methane and chemical losses. Fracking requires a lot of water as well, which can negatively affect water quality and availability for other needs. Next. History. In 1975, the Energy Policy and Conservation Act was passed, working as a blueprint to create national REACH codes in all buildings for test procedures, labeling, and energy targets for consumers. This allowed for the creation of national building codes and standards. Next, please. In 2011, the Pipeline Safety, Regulatory Certainty, and Job Creation Act became law, forcing oil, natural gas, and hazardous liquid pipelines to regulate the location and comply with a set of standard risk analysis for their pipelines. Next. Over 50 cities and counties in California have adopted new building construction REACH codes banning natural gas in new developments. These codes significantly lower our society's future and reliance on natural gas.
So what is the Methane Mitigation Act? Next slide, please. The first part consists of a national REACH code banning natural gas in all new building developments in order to reduce emissions. Next slide. According to the Environmental Protection Agency in 2017, commercial and residential buildings are responsible for 12% of the nation's emissions, and natural gas accounts for the bulk of it. Of that 12%, 67% was made from natural gas. Next slide, please. The natural gas banning REACH codes currently being passed are slightly different versions of the same policy, which is frustrating for developers and inefficient overall. This policy prepares the nation for a future without dependency on fracking and natural gas. This policy would vastly reduce the large carbon footprint of new buildings. Next slide, please. An estimated $20.5 billion a year in subsidies goes to fossil fuels, which is which about 80% go to crude oil and natural gas. This policy recommends that clean energy be subsidized in low and middle income communities to support the adjustment to these national reach codes. These subsidies would be paid for by the money that had been previously used to subsidize the natural gas and crude oil industries. Now I will pass it on to my colleague, Jamie. Next slide.
Next slide, please. As a greenhouse gas, methane is 80 times more potent than carbon dioxide during its first 20 years in the atmosphere. Next slide, please. A study in Nature magazine found that 30 to 40% of all natural gases extracted are leaked into the atmosphere, and one leak plugged in April 2019 by the company Turkmen Oil represented about 1 million cars taken off the road per year. Next slide, please. Scientists agree that identifying methane sources, such as leaks from natural gas fracking, is crucial to making the drastic emissions cuts goals required by the UN IPCC report guidelines and avoid the worst possible impacts of the climate crisis. NASA has already begun conducting methane leakage satellite detection. For example, NASA is using the Airborne Visible Infrared Imaging Spectrometer Next Generation, or AVRIS-NG for short, which can detect plumes of methane in great detail. Next slide, please. A NASA team using the AVRIS-NG to study leakage in California found that a few super-emitter leakage sites were responsible for about 1/3 of the total California methane budget. However, as recently as August 2020, methane leakage standards have been removed. Next slide, please. Studies done by the EPA found that roughly 47% of methane leakage from natural gas occurs during production, so targeting the production companies with leakage regulation is most immediately efficient. Next slide, please. Funding from money redistributed from subsidies that were previously granted to natural gas companies should be granted to NASA so that the AVRIS-NG technology is used to detect and report on methane leakage nationwide. The results of this detection would be available to the public and sent to the EPA, which would be tasked with alerting offending natural gas companies of their leakage, providing them with the most recent results of the AVRIS-NG detection, and using fines. Companies will be granted time to stop their leakage, and the EPA will be tasked with enforcing significant fines on companies that fail to plug their leakage in the provided amount of time. The money from such fines will be used to further fund NASA satellite leakage detection teams or fund the replacement of leaky pipes in low-income communities.
Voting considerations. Democrats have a history of supporting clean energy and the reduction of greenhouse gases. Next slide, please. This proposal in particular may appeal to Republican voters as well. Republicans are often pro-business and fiscally conservative. And as phase 2 of this proposal would limit leakage, it would help companies retain and sell more of their product. This leakage research and regulation would reduce greenhouse gas emissions throughout the country, something that would be more likely to appeal to Democrats. Democrats will almost certainly support this proposal, yet some incentives have been included that may gain some Republican support. Next slide, please. The Methane Mitigation Act is focused on decreasing the reliance on natural gas in the United States and decreasing the leakage of these gases during extraction. We have proposed a national reach code to ban all new natural gas in all new buildings. Using the AVRIS-NG satellite, NASA is responsible for monitoring and reporting leakages nationwide. Next slide, please. The FERC is responsible for ensuring that these new buildings can structurally support non-gas powered utilities. The United States Environmental Protection Agency is responsible for holding these companies accountable to follow these regulations. Those who do not follow these requirements will be fined accordingly. This is the end of our presentation. Thank you for listening.
Very thoughtful. What I'm not sure of is there a national leakage detection legislation? Did you reference that anywhere, or you're proposing that there be such legislation and then, packed into it what you're proposing, how it directs itself?
Yeah, so there's not currently any national leakage detection. Okay. Previously, technologies were really hard for companies to use because it involved using a big truck to bring it out to the natural gas sites, which were pretty remote. So now that we have the technology of the Avarice NG, which is satellite driven, it's much more easy to detect leakage on a national scale. So that's what we're proposing.
Okay, very good. I've noted that there have been several articles recently about the consideration of banning gas stoves. So, you know, the thinking is starting in the kitchen. You're ahead of that by this a part of your presentation, which is excellent. It's stunning the amount of what is emitted because of the leakage. It really took my breath away. Those are huge amounts escaping into the atmosphere. Thank you.
All right. Next, we have the Biodiversity and Deforestation Subcommittee with members Chanel Chu, Adarsh Ambadi, Lauren Dove, Kevin Chian, Simran Patel, and Damien Cardenas.
Hello, my name is Adarsh Ambadi, and I'm glad to be the chair for this subcommittee. We'll be presenting on bioremediation and agroforestry techniques as a response to biodiversity loss and deforestation. Next slide, please. And then you can just move on from here. Oh.
All right, starting off, we're going to introduce the importance of biodiversity. Next slide, please. So the biodiversity is critical to the survival of community because it sustains all the different types of ecosystems on the earth. These properly functioning ecosystems supply us with oxygen, food, clean air, and water. Next slide, please.
Here we have a quote from the New York Times stating that the twin crises of climate change and biodiversity loss are inextricably linked. This is due to the fact that trees reduce carbon levels and therefore the clearing of forests intensifies climate change. In fact, an estimated 5% of species are at risk of extinction from global warming alone. Critical facts such as these accentuate the significance of restoring forests and biodiversity loss in order to mitigate the negative effects of climate change. Next slide, please. Now we have Adarsh presenting the problem.
You can move up. So perfect. Globally, there are three major threats to biodiversity right now, which include destruction, degradation, and the fragmentation of habitats. And all of them, or rather most of them, are caused by human interference. You can move to the next slide. So according to the UN Global Assessment Report, there are currently 1 million animals and plant species that are threatened with extinction, which is more than ever before in human history. This means that 75% of the world's terrestrial environment has essentially been severely altered to date by human actions. And so clearly, major steps need to be taken to counteract these negative effects. Next slide, please. Still, with these clear problems, according to the same report, governments spend $500 billion per year on environmentally harmful initiatives, while total public and private financing for biodiversity protection came to a fraction of that, which is just $80 to $90 billion. So you can see there's a clear biodiversity cost disparity. Next slide, please.
So our first proposed solution is bioremediation, and bioremediation serves more as a short-term response to the growing biodiversity crisis in the United States. Next slide, please. So essentially, bioremediation is the process that involves introducing microbes into contaminated areas to break down harmful pollutants. As a result, this cleans the contaminated ecosystem while preserving the biodiversity that exists there. Next slide, please. So bioremediation is somewhat of a complicated process, but there are two overarching main processes, and those are ex situ bioremediation and in situ bioremediation. Ex situ bioremediation involves translocating pollutants to a controlled lab setting where the microbes are then introduced, while in situ bioremediation involves introducing microbes directly to the site of contamination. Both of these procedures involve a survey of contamination, which means observing the type of pollution and the polluted medium, whether that's soil or water, and also an analysis of the suitable microbes. Next slide, please. So bioremediation is still an emerging science, which means that many of its techniques are still in their stages of development. And this table basically lists various bioremediation techniques and how far they are in terms of their maturity. Next slide, please. So to sum up, bioremediation has three main advantages. First, it is relatively inexpensive when compared to other forms of ecosystem restoration. Second, it results in the complete removal of harmful pollutants. And third, it uses a natural means to dispose of contamination. Next slide, please.
So today I'll be presenting on our second and long-term solution, which is agroforestry. Next slide, please. So what is agroforestry? Agroforestry is a general name for land use management systems and technologies that integrate trees and shrubbery into agricultural landscapes. Next slide, please. According to the USDA, there are 5 main systems of agroforestry. There's alley cropping, forest farming, silvopasture, riparian forest buffers, and windbreaks. Next slide, please. Agroforestry systems can have many benefits, a few including carbon sequestration, improved water quality, and soil stabilization. This can help to gradually eliminate the use of chemical fertilizers and pesticides, which has proven to have a harmful impact on biodiversity. Agroforestry can also be utilized to provide habitats for various wildlife species. Next slide, please. However, agroforestry is a long-term solution. The systems may take many years to mature before being able to generate significant profit, and it's also a labor-intensive system because proper management requires adequate knowledge of agriculture, substantial planning, as well as regular maintenance. Next slide, please. On the other hand, Ernst Gosch, a leading figure in the field of sustainable agriculture, estimates that agroforestry systems can ultimately create 8 times more profit than conventional agriculture. According to Project Drawdown, a carbon solution tracking initiative, the implementation of agroforestry on a global scale is also estimated to sequester around 9.3 billion gigatons of carbon by the year 2050. Though the implementation of agroforestry techniques across US farms may not seem profitable at first, in the end, it is a worthwhile investment that will only provide increased benefits with time. Next slide, please.
Okay, now we're going to go into the background of agroforestry and bioremediation. Next slide, please. A significant amount of legislation has been passed in support of agroforestry. The Agricultural Resilience Act of 2020, for example, passed by the House of Representatives, established multiple agroforestry centers in the US, and the Senate Appropriations Committee recommended the development of integrated strategies to manage multifunctional agricultural landscapes that utilize agroforestry techniques. While clearly there is a lot of support for these techniques, the greatest problem is that there are no industry standards for them, nor are there any incentive for the switch to these sustainable strategies. Next slide, please. Although bioremediation is an emerging science, it also has a significant history. It has been used in the past to clean up many polluted sites and has specifically been used to clean up those where there have been oil spills, such as the British Petroleum's Deepwater Horizon or the Exxon Valdez oil spill, for which bioremediation was supported by the EPA and the regional response team. Next slide, please.
Okay, now on to our conclusion. Next slide. Referring back to the introduction, we have a quote from WWF International stating that humans have significantly altered 75% of the Earth's ice-free land, and now only 25% can still be considered wilderness. This brings up the importance of biodiversity and our role in the natural world, as the most common cause of the damaging of biodiversity is a result of detrimental human involvement, specifically for agricultural purposes. Therefore, our major responsibilities in this regard are the preservation of existing biodiversity and the rectification of damages that have been incurred. Next slide, please. In the restatement of our proposal, in regards to bioremediation, we propose the further facilitation of EPA research projects on the techniques that fall under bioremediation, such as in situ and ex situ, as well as the development of a strategy that governments on the local, state, and federal levels can take in the demonstration of the effective use of these techniques as a response to contamination.
Next, with regards to our long-term solution, agroforestry, we hope that we can set industry standards and clear guidelines for each of the 5 main agroforestry techniques in order to limit hazards to biodiversity. And second, we also plan to incentivize farmers to transition to these more sustainable practices through agricultural subsidies. Next slide, please. Ultimately, our end goal is that, and our hope is that with the US taking charge and transforming the way we interact with the environment, the entire world will follow, using these policies as an example. And by following this plan, we can hope to establish the United States as a clear model for biodiversity protection. Next slide, please. And the last two slides are our citations.
Me? In the interest of time, I'm not going to question, so we can move on. But it was a terrific panel. You did a great job with that. Every panel is brilliant.
Next up, we have the Carbon Capture and Storage Subcommittee. The members speaking will be Kayla Davis, Kennedy Emerson, Catherine Evans, David Martinez, and Jennifer Remigius.
So as Akshay said, we are the Carbon Capture Subcommittee. Next slide, please. And to start with an overview of our presentation, we'll be going over the history of carbon capture and how it seeks to help solve climate change, provide our proposed solution and possible opposition that may come in response, and finish with a summary of the presentation as a whole. Next slide, please. So carbon capture as we know it today was first acknowledged as a potential technology in 1977, although it didn't start gaining the popularity it has today until the 2000s as industry leaders such as Bill Gates and Elon Musk began investing in and discussing the technology. Today, there exist 10 large-scale functioning carbon capture facilities in the US alone, with 26 in operation worldwide and 39 more being in development. Despite it being a relatively new solution in regards to reducing emissions, many climate scientists view it as promising and critical in keeping our global temperature increases below the 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius mark. Next slide, please. So the main point in contention involving carbon capture technology is based in how it's used, either for sequestration or utilization purposes. Both have their benefits and drawbacks, and as such, we thought it critical to include both in our proposal. While sequestration is viewed by many as a potential silver bullet due to its ability to take in and store emissions from the atmosphere, its efficacy and safety have been debated as its underground storage creates a potential to fail, and studies have shown that pollution can actually increase in areas of a plant, limiting where this capture can occur. Meanwhile, utilization reuses rather than stores this captured carbon, allowing it to be repurposed as fuel, building materials, or parts of other commodities, giving an economic edge over sequestration as it provides a potential incentive for its use by companies while also replacing carbon-intensive processes with carbon-neutral ones. Overall, neither solution alone is perfectly effective in solving climate change, and as such, both must be taken into consideration as we look to a more green energy-focused future. What we seek to address is how the US in particular can take advantage of this new technology in our national fight against climate change. Next slide, please.
President Biden has pledged to meet a net zero emissions goal by the year 2050. Until the United States reaches net zero emissions, more carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases will continue to be released into the atmosphere every day. David Roberts from Vox suggested that net zero emissions goals may take longer to reach than expected. As such, even more CO2 will be released before true neutrality is reached. Thus, a safe way may be needed to remove carbon dioxide from the air, especially if net zero goals are not met in time. Research from Stanford University suggests that the sequestration of carbon dioxide is not a permanent solution and actually poses a number of risks. For example, if there is an earthquake that impacts a carbon dioxide sequestration area, the captured carbon dioxide may be released back into the atmosphere. Yet, the development of sequestration technology could still be useful in the future. All things considered, we suggest that the best solution to this problem is mainly through carbon capture utilization, as this method does not have the risks that sequestration poses and provides more benefits as well. Next slide, please.
We propose, next slide please, that $50 million from the Environmental Protection Agency budget be allocated to qualified carbon capture utilization and sequestration initiatives, with 75% of it going to utilization technology and the other 25% to sequestration. In addition to the qualifications outlined in the Carbon Capture Improvement Act of 2019, we assert that in order to receive funding, a company must be carbon neutral, cutting at least 50% of their emissions through methods other than carbon capture. Our proposal also includes legislation regarding the monetization of captured carbon. Again, the facilities must be qualified. Captured carbon may also not be used for activities that would release more greenhouse gases or have other negative impacts on the environment. Furthermore, the proposal places restrictions on carbon capture sequestration technology, specifically those imposed by the Underground Injection Control Program under the Environmental Protection Agency. Next slide, please. The proposal would have many positive effects on the environment and the economy. As a nation, we should be striving to reduce our carbon emissions, and carbon capture technologies will assist us in that effort. An emphasis on carbon capture utilization technologies will also stimulate the economy, providing jobs and steering us towards the renewable energy market, which has recently been receiving a lot of attention. Slowing the effects of climate change would also reduce personal healthcare costs, as well as the private and public infrastructure costs that come with natural disasters like wildfires, a common symptom of a damaged environment. Next slide, please.
As for the legislative analysis, I will discuss the supporters and opposers. Next slide, please. Supporters of carbon capture and utilization mainly stand in government agencies, environmental groups, and activists. And as previously stated, carbon capture is a fairly new technology. But in December of 2020, Congress passed the Energy Act and the Use Act, which were both fairly bipartisan agreements in both the House and the Senate. These bills helped guide our proposal to determine the funds and background needed on carbon capture and help to provide an idea of who may endorse this bill. Next slide, please. So insufficient data and unproven technology has concerned companies and industries who feel carbon capture has little to no economic benefits. Most evidently, companies and industries are reluctant to invest because they feel wind, solar, and electric cars are able to start small and build on niche demand. And some legislators and activists have focused on capturing carbon by earthier means. And in other words, their argument is that climate change does not have to come at the expense of new technology, but at the extent of available resources and societal will. However, our legislation focuses on utilization. So such means could alter their views, as our proposal plans to utilize carbon and provide secondary economic benefits through efficient distribution of carbon. We believe this addresses all oppositions whose primary concerns is the environment and those whose primary concern is the economy.
Next slide,
Next slide, please.
Another form of opposition comes from climate-conscious individuals who fear that carbon capture technology will keep the United States reliant on fossil fuel infrastructure. However, carbon capture can help to reduce the carbon emissions from fossil fuels and assist in transitioning towards clean energy. For example, oil generated using captured carbon produces 37% less emissions than conventional methods. The significance is that fossil fuels can be phased out with as little carbon emissions as possible thanks to carbon capture. Next slide, please.
It has become more than clear that immediate action is needed against rising carbon emissions to minimize the damage from climate change. Our bill would greatly assist in fighting this, as the financial support it would provide to CCU projects would help to reach the IPCC's goal of removing 100 billion to 1 trillion tons of CO2 from our atmosphere. While some may remain skeptical, the research and regulations our proposal implements will help to eliminate these concerns. To close, we believe our proposal provides a strong basis for future carbon capture and climate-focused legislation as we hope to move towards a greener country. Thank you.
Okay, quick question. Are you recommending to me CCU?
So our proposal in particular endorses both CCU and CCS, with an emphasis on CCU since it seemingly provides more economic benefits and incentive for use in the private sector.
Okay, thank you. Excellent. Excellent presentation. Another excellent presentation. Keep going.
Our next subcommittee is the Natural Disaster Subcommittee with members Annabelle Doherty, Robbie Hall, Toby Walpole, Tejas Kurkure, and Casey Platkin.
All right, my name is Casey Platkin. I'm the chair of this subcommittee. Let's get started. Can you move to the next slide? One more, sorry. All right, so our subcommittee was assigned natural disasters in relation to climate change. We've narrowed our focus specifically onto floods. Global warming has exacerbated sea levels, extreme weather, and subsequently floods. The ramifications of floods in the US is not only $5.2 billion in general property damage, but also a loss of 15 million homes a year. There are several causes for floods, such as sea level rises, floodplains expansions, and heavy storms, but they're all rooted in climate change. In addition to recent growth, our nation's floodplains are expected to grow by approximately 45% by century's end. Heavier precipitation events are expected to spike from 50% to as much as 3 times the historical average throughout the 21st century. Whether it's a storm, rising sea levels, or a breaking dam, such as the recent floods in Hawaii, our country needs to be prepared with strong infrastructure to protect ourselves from the natural disasters fueled by climate change. Through our research, we've narrowed our focus down to specifically fighting this problem through the National Flood Insurance Program. To describe our proposal, I just first want to recap the National Flood Insurance Program. Basically, it's a program within FEMA that provides flood insurance to around 23,000 flood-prone cities across the country. Now, the price of your insurance is a combination of different factors, such as the rate of floods in your region, recent weather, and also the quality of flood mitigation infrastructure in your city. And this is where the community rating systems come in. Essentially, if a municipality decides to invest in anti-flood infrastructure, they can score, or they can get a new community rating system score, which will lower the cost of insurance for their residents and provide more flood-resilient cities. This is what we propose to invest in. We propose to allocate an extra $50 million a year to the National Flood Insurance Program to build anti-flood infrastructure. After construction of the infrastructure, residents will enjoy discounts from between 5 to 45% on their monthly National Flood Insurance programs. To maximize the economic stimulus from the investment, our proposal will mandate that infrastructure be built with community workforce agreements, which mandate prevailing wages, healthcare benefits, and pensions to other workplace protections to workers. The influx of high-paying jobs, discounted flood insurance, and additional flood management infrastructure will not only help communities recover from the COVID-19 recession, but also reduce damage in future floods. On to you, Tejas.
Thank you, Casey. Next slide, please.
Oops, sorry. I forgot to say next slide during the thing, my bad.
Yeah, sorry, one more slide. Awesome. So now we'll discuss how flood insurance has changed throughout the years. The Bigger Waters Flood Insurance Reform Act of 2012 authorized the National Mapping Program and increased rates of insurance. It marked a change in the program by switching from subsidized benefits to actuarial rates that were reflective of the risk involved. This resulted in a 10-fold increase in the rates, contradicting the original plan to decrease them. Next slide, please. The Homeowner Flood Insurance Affordability Act of 2014 attempted to remedy these mistakes. The act limited two of the actions that FEMA could take with flood insurance. To start, it suspended the ability to increase rates for properties in areas that were subjected to premium adjustment. It also reduced the subsidies for any property not insured by the flood program as of July 6, 2012. This prohibited FEMA from providing flood insurance at rates less than those estimated for any property purchased 6 months after that expiration deadline. Next slide, please. To provide even more legislative background, we first examined Senate Bill 3418, which allocated $100 million in funding assistance to local governments to implement projects designed to reduce natural disaster risk. For context, the U.S. Government Accountability Office serves as the supreme audit institution and examines FEMA regulations and the effectiveness of entity loan funds. House Bill 2157 provided additional supplemental appropriations for disaster relief, along with $17.2 billion to federal agencies to mediate expenses related to wildfires, floods, volcanoes, earthquakes, and other natural disasters. Next slide, please. Our $50 million will be used to improve flood mitigation infrastructure, including constructing elevated buildings and installing efficient gutters. These funds will also contribute to public awareness campaigns that will educate people on how to protect themselves and their property in the event of a flood. Next slide, please, and on to you, Casey.
Awesome. Thank you, Tejas. So on September 30th of last year's continuing appropriations bill, Congress reauthorized the National Flood Insurance Program's funding for 1 year by a vote of 359 to 57. So this next reauthorization this year will be for the following 5 years. And this is the time we propose the subsidy. Meanwhile, we can analyze the vote count of the previous year's authorization to plan our political strategy. Typically, Democrats are pretty unified on this issue and we would assume would support the proposal. Well, Republicans aren't as reliable. The no's on the previous reauthorizations were pretty much all Republicans. But if the GOP had been united against the issue, we would have seen a much closer vote count. Instead, of the over 200 Republicans in the House, only 57 voted against temporary reauthorization, meaning 3/4 of Republicans voted yes, leading us to believe 3/4 of the GOP would be open to at least a subsidy that would reform the NFIP. So our bill, next slide. Our bill would most likely go to the Subcommittee on Housing, Community Development, and Insurance. Democrats have a pretty clear majority, but as we mentioned before, we would like bipartisanship. Representative Steve Stiver is the ranking Republican, and he's retiring this year, but a special election wouldn't be until after the next reauthorization. We can assume he will still lead the GOP in this committee, and he's actually put out a poll to his constituents in preparation for this vote to see if they support the National Flood Insurance Program and whether they want it reauthorized or not. This confirms he's one of the 3/4 of the GOP that are open to reform, giving us enthusiasm about the likelihood of this passing committee. To convince Republicans, we propose to cultivate a message of reformation to the National Flood Insurance Program, painting the subsidy as a long-term solution to prevent future deficits and promote fiscal stability within the program. Next slide, on to Annabelle.
Perfect. So the really big thing here is that we really want to highlight that there is a deficit and that our bill will be a reform to that deficit to the NFIP. And so by presenting it as a reform, it should be more bipartisan with the influx of local labour and high quality jobs. It should be supported across the board along with the heavy economic benefits that will come along with it. Next slide. Wonderful. So to summarise, this bill will not only improve communities' ability to recover from floods at a base level, but by raising each community's community rating system, it's going to lower flood insurance for individual homeowners, which will allow them more stability and encouragement to purchase homes. This should help stimulate the economy, along with utilising local workers to help build the new infrastructure, creating more job opportunities in the area. Overall, this creates much more economic stability for both individual homeowners and the community through lowered insurance rates and the right infrastructure to keep them safe in the case of a flood. Next slide. Wonderful. And so to compare, actually we're a little bit short on time, just skip this one. Sorry, there you go, perfect. So next slide. So we propose an extra 50 million is allocated to the National Flood Insurance Program to build anti-flood infrastructure for communities, incorporate the community rating system, provide discounts on national flood insurance for homeowners, employ community workforce agreements to mandate prevailing wages, healthcare benefits, pensions, and other workplace protections for workers, and to overall to provide recovery from COVID and support for small communities in flooding areas. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to our proposal, and we're open to any questions you may have for us. Thank you.
Unmuted. Yeah. Well, bravo. You did an excellent job on this. National flood insurance has continually changed, and you've tracked the record really well in the Congress, what different bills that became laws, what they did. What continued to outstrip the effectiveness of what we had done previously was obviously climate change, because the floods are more impactful and the losses are greater. The need for more policies, more money, community rating systems. Our systems have constantly been diminished because the needs keep getting greater. The needs keep getting greater. You mentioned in 2020 in Hawaii, what happened there. There are many situations across the country, and I would add to it that when we have dry weather, when we have a drought, which is brought about by climate change, then we are susceptible to even wilder fires. And then after we deal with the fires, when we have rain, the soil is destabilized and we have floods. So this is it really is a huge challenge. I think you've done an excellent job with it. And I think the recommendations that you've made, I'm going to take to the committees of jurisdiction. I think you've done a great job with this. And it's one hell of a problem for homeowners to live in an area that is established as a flood zone and not be able to secure insurance, or the insurance that is available is completely out of reach because you have to be a multi-millionaire to be able to afford the premiums on those insurance policies. So it's just I think I described the domino effect of one thing after another. So good for you for taking this on. Excellent.
Awesome. So now we're going to hear from the Climate Diplomacy Subcommittee, and the members who will be presenting are Jeremy Baum, Derek Sue, Jordan King, Andrew Liu, and Akshay Manglik.
Hello and welcome to the climate diplomacy presentation. Today in this presentation, we'll be talking a little bit about the challenges and successes of international cooperation with climate change policy and agreements, and discuss some resolutions to some of the more challenging issues facing climate change in the international arena right now. Next slide. Next slide.
So generally, over the past 30 years, there's been a consistent focus on having countries join together to ensure that climate change doesn't become worse. The United Nations Climate Change Conference and the United Nations Framework on the Convention of Climate Change were historical steps towards focusing on diplomacy between the countries.
Jeremy, excuse me. Jeremy, can you turn up the volume so we can hear you better? I don't know if anyone else is having a problem. I don't want to miss a word.
What about now?
That's much better.
Okay.
That's great. Thank you.
So generally over the past 30 years, there's been a consistent focus on having countries join together to ensure that climate change doesn't become worse. The COP, or the United Nations Climate Change Conference, and then the UNFCCC, or the United Nations Framework on the Conventions on Climate Change, were historical steps towards focusing on diplomacy between countries when regarding climate change. But as it stands now, the United States has not been a leader in the climate change space, partly due to the Trump administration, but also partly due to the country just staying out of it. The US's failure to form diplomatic ties with countries on the topic shapes climate policy and leaves the country without the proper tools that it needs to tackle the environmental crises of our time. As such, it's very clear that the United States must take action now to pave the way for a greener future. And next slide.
The US has been involved in many multilateral agreements and treaties over the years, starting around 1987 with one of the most significant, which was the Montreal Protocol, in which a specific kind of carbon emission was agreed to be reduced by almost every country and was successful in preventing the depletion of the ozone layer. Later in 1997, there was the Kyoto Protocol. However, this was stalled in Congress, and in 2001, President Bush withdrew the US from the treaty because there was not enough support behind it in the US. As a result, the Kyoto Protocol wasn't as successful in creating some of the carbon emission reductions that it had aimed for. More recently, with the Copenhagen talks in 2009, there have been more discussions on how to address climate change in this 21st century. And this eventually, although initially not so successful, led to the 2015 Paris Climate Accords, which were not mandatory agreements, but rather voluntary contributions to climate reduction. And that has seen some success. However, there's continued work that needs to be done. There are other ways in which the US engages in climate diplomacy. One of them is the Green Climate Fund, where the US can deploy funds in order to support projects internationally that lead to better, more efficient use of fossil fuels and other forms of energy. Next slide.
So our legislative proposal consists of three main pillars. Next slide, please. First is the Climate Change Diplomacy and Development Act. This was introduced in December 2020 by Representative Ted Deutsch of Florida and Senator Ben Cardin of Maryland. And it required basically the State Department and USAID to collaborate together on developing a joint and coordinated climate change strategy. And this represents a really significant step towards streamlining the different diplomatic actions by different federal actors. And it especially focuses on the effects that climate change could have on women, which would be disproportionate. Second, it directs the State Department and USAID to reduce the emissions, allocate funds to reduce those emissions in their buildings and their programs. And finally, it mandates the Secretary of State to report annually to Congress on the progress made in the strategy. The bill has not been reintroduced into the current Congress, so we recommend that you reintroduce it, or in the future, if it is reintroduced, we recommend that you co-sponsor the bill. We also recommend that you amend it to prioritize negotiations that are smaller with the largest emitters like China, Russia, India, Korea, and Brazil. That leads to a greater chance of a strong agreement while still covering the vast majority of carbon emissions, well over 80%. Next slide, please. Second, we have the Green Climate Fund Authorization Act. So as Andrew mentioned, the Green Climate Fund is the world's largest climate fund, and it funds both mitigation and adaptation efforts in developing countries specifically. So the goal is to raise $100 billion. It's already raised $9.8 billion so far, and it covers 150 different projects. And it's unique in how it emphasizes the sovereignty of developing countries by investing directly in NGOs and local institutions, while also prioritizing human rights and clean development. President Obama in 2014 committed $3 billion to the fund, but we've only paid $1 billion, and congressional action is necessary to bridge the gap. So the Green Climate Fund Authorization Act, which was introduced in 2019 by Representative Adriano Espaillat of New York, would continually authorize appropriations to meet these goals. And so we recommend that you reintroduce it since it hasn't been reintroduced yet, or co-sponsor it if it will be reintroduced. Next slide, please. The final pillar of our recommendation is funding for the Adaptation Fund. The Adaptation Fund is a smaller fund that is dedicated to adaptation projects in developing countries. So it has $800 million in funding that covers 115 projects that would directly benefit 27 million people. It's noted for providing direct access, which are projects which would be helping projects quickly get off the ground and provide almost immediate help to people in developing nations. The US has never donated to the fund before, but we recommend that you allocate $60 million in funding to the Adaptation Fund, which would tie us as being the largest donor to the fund. Next slide, please. As for the voting considerations, we believe that Democrats would almost uniformly support this proposal. We believe it also gets support from moderate Republicans if framed as America reclaiming the mantle of international leadership on climate change, rather than ceding international influence to China. The GCF in particular has support among the Appropriations Committee and John Kerry. Next slide, please.
Here are the lasting impacts of our proposal. Next slide, please. The introduction of these proposed bills and allocation for more resources leads to a plethora of benefits. This proposal uniquely sets a standard for future administrations and reverses previous isolationist trends on this issue. It shifts America into an international leader and bolsters credibility, solidifying climate diplomacy as a major facet of US foreign policy. The US can formally take a leadership role in solving climate change. Next slide, please. Our proposal presents an enormous opportunity for broader international cooperation. It can promote dialogue and more complete conversations. It can battle health risks posed by air and water pollution in countries with lax regulation. It can bolster clean and sustainable infrastructure in developing countries, and it can mitigate areas most vulnerable to climate change. With these impacts in mind, we urge you to consider this proposal. Thank you.
Thank you. That was excellent. And just one quick comment, and that is we talked about American leadership. I think that the Paris Accords was a demonstration of American leadership on the global stage. I was one of the members to be a part of working on those accords, and just to show you how sensitive they were, all the countries in the world gathered. If there was one country that raised their hand and disagreed, the entire agreement would have failed. It was American leadership that produced that. And I want to underscore this because of how important it was and what American leadership looks like. That was destroyed by the last administration. And at the beginning of President Biden's administration, it was either the first day or in the first week, we rejoined our countries from around the world in the Paris Accord. So, and I'm very pleased about that, but obviously there's a lot more to do. So excellent presentation. Thank you, students. You're really something. This is so deep and broad and thorough. I'm so proud of you. Let's go to the next one.
Our next subcommittee is the Climate Refugee Subcommittee. The members are Libby Egenmeyer, Shreya Paul, Ashley Lee, Natalie Laker, Clara DeGoy Sands, and Ilaria Fresia.
Good afternoon, Congresswoman Eshoo, and thank you for listening to our presentations and considering our proposals. Myself, along with fellow group members Ilaria and Natalie, will be presenting on the growing problem of climate refugees and how they can be incorporated into domestic immigration systems.
So first, we'll be starting off with some background information on what exactly a climate refugee is. A climate refugee is an individual who is unable or unwilling to return to their country of nationality or habitual residence due to a well-founded fear or evidence of the impact of climate-induced disasters. To demonstrate the scope of the issue, between September of 2020 and February of 2021, 10.3 million people were displaced as a result of climate change. Next, presenting on why the US should confront this issue is Ilaria.
The US should confront this issue for two reasons. Next slide. The first of those reasons being carbon emissions. The US is one of the world's greatest producers of carbon emissions, which is a huge contributor to our current climate issues and those resulting disasters. The US emits about 15% of the world's total annual carbon dioxide, second only to China. The US Energy Information Administration estimates that in 2019, the US emitted 5.1 billion metric tons of energy-related carbon dioxide, while the global emissions of energy-related carbon dioxide totaled 33.1 billion metric tons annual. Because of this, we have a moral and statistical obligation to help those impacted. Next slide. The second reason why the US should help is that we have the strongest economy in the world and should therefore be responsible for the financial support of climate refugees. Combined with the carbon emissions, we are most able to support people forced to flee their homes, and ethically, we're most responsible. Next, explaining our looking ahead will be Natalie.
In the near future, the population of climate refugees is expected to grow dramatically. For our first example, in the Pacific, many low-lying islands are in danger of being completely submerged due to rising sea levels. This phenomenon will leave thousands of inhabitants displaced from islands such as Tuvalu and the Maldives, among many others. Next slide. Furthermore, in the past year, we've seen a surge in migrants at the US-Mexico border. This issue intersects with climate change since climate events have exacerbated existing problems for these migrants like food and housing insecurity. Many migrants have been driven to the border due to environmental events such as hurricanes Ida and Iota or droughts in Central America. Next slide. It's easy to see how people are displaced due to climate change with evidence from our own backyard. In 2020, we saw the California wildfires displace many as houses were burned down and entire cities were demolished. For people with less access to transportation or who live in smaller countries, these kinds of situations can add to the number of climate refugees. Next slide. We can sympathize with these people when we recognize that 850,000 homes were destroyed in Hurricane Katrina's aftermath and thousands were left homeless after the California wildfires. Next, Ilaria will elaborate on the issue that our plan focuses on.
The problem is that there's currently no legal definition of a climate refugee, and as a consequence, they are excluded from international and domestic law and policy. There's no special protections or asylum under any law that's currently implemented, and there's no safe pathway for their relocation in the event that they're displaced because of a natural disaster. Next slide. For further persuasion, extreme weather displaces nearly 3 times more people than conflict and nearly 9 times more than fear of prosecution. It should therefore be included into the definition. Proposing our solution is Clara.
Thank you, Ilaria. So, how do we tackle this issue? In our current asylum process, the asylee must indicate a well-founded fear of persecution in their home country in order to avoid removal from the United States. However, when we consider the actual intent of our asylum process, we see that it is meant to accommodate individuals who require urgent allowance into the country because they are unsafe or unable to return home. In today's day and age, people are all too often put into this situation because of climate disasters, like those, for instance, fleeing the famine in Yemen. Persecution is no longer the only reason one must flee their home, and our legal system must accommodate for such. Next slide, please. So we have a two-pronged approach to tackling this issue. First off, Congress would have to amend the definition of a refugee in the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965. After, Form I-589, the asylum application form, must be edited to comply with the changes. Why focus our efforts on the asylum process? It is the protocol for those seeking urgent admission into the country or withholding of removal, often used by those fleeing violence or persecution or threats to their livelihood. There are concrete documents that outline the requirements to apply for asylum, like for instance, Form I-589, which must be filed within 1 year of one's arrival to the United States. Process is varied, but is extremely lengthy and usually takes between 6 months and several years. There's 2 processes to apply, affirmative asylum and defensive asylum, and the USCIS office is the one that processes these applications, and an officer decides if one is granted asylum, and if asylum is denied, they are referred for removal. Next slide, please. The Immigration Nationality Act was passed in 1965 and built on previous immigration legislation from the 20s. These acts lay the groundwork for U.S. immigration policy. In conducting our research on the issue of climate refugees, we discovered that there is no legal definition and subsequently no inclusion of climate refugees in domestic law, despite an increase in climate and natural disaster-related immigration. Climate refugees do not receive any specific protections or asylum under current law, specifically under the 1965 Immigration Nationality Act. While the United States has a few statutory provisions, such as the temporary protected status or the deferred enforced departure, these options are temporary and limited. Thus, the U.S. immigration framework does not aptly provide a pathway for international, forcibly displaced climate migrants to seek refuge and escape the perilous nature of their current residence. A lack of accepted terminology within the U.S. systems hampers effective accommodation of these refugees. The United States must implement a new framework that cements a clear definition of what a climate refugee is, which can be done by amending this act to define a refugee as a person who is unable or unwilling to return to his or her country of nationality because of persecution or a well-founded fear of persecution on account of race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group or political opinion, or because of a threat to their livelihood due to climate-related circumstances. Next slide, please. Then, Form I-589 would be amended to comply with this new definition. It is the asylum application form for refugees seeking to come to the U.S. Currently, there are provisions for seeking asylum or withholding of removal from the United States for reasons pertaining to race, religion, nationality, political opinion, membership in a particular social group, or the Torture Convention. However, those fleeing a famine, drought, or a home decimated by a natural disaster do not fit any of those categories, but are equally in desperate need of asylum. Hence, this form should be amended to fit the new definition of refugee in the Immigration and Nationality Act and include climate-related circumstances as a valid reason for asylum seeking. And this amendment could be passed as a part of a larger immigration reform bill. The likely effects of these amendments would be an increase in asylum applications, which the USCIS is currently not financially equipped to handle. As previously stated, the asylum process is already extremely slow and does not respond appropriately to the urgent nature of seeking asylum. However, when we look at government budgets in the past years and for the future, there's a lot of money that could be diverted into the USCIS. For instance, the 2022 budget includes $7.99 billion for ICE, an increase from the 2021 budget's funding for ICE. Meanwhile, USCIS has been struggling to stay afloat and in March stated they would have to furlough 13,400 workers if they did not receive more funding or bailouts from Congress. The United States must devote more resources to ensuring legal immigration processes function efficiently and smoothly, which would deter people from immigrating illegally, rather than hunting down and incarcerating those that immigrated illegally through a corrupt, problematic, and inhumane agency. The Biden administration has already demonstrated a financial commitment to combating the climate crisis. The 2022 budget includes a nearly 20% increase in funding for the Interior Department, in large part to address the climate crisis. Increasing funding for the USCIS would allow for efficient asylum processing, which would help tackle a very real consequence of climate change, climate refugees. Next slide, please. That is our proposal on how to tackle this growing issue and incorporate climate refugees into our immigration system. Thank you for listening. And Congresswoman Eshoo, do you have any questions?
Well, let me just say that, every subcommittee has really taken on a tough issue. None of these are easy. This is one of the toughest. It's one of the toughest because it is an area that causes that brings about or generates a great deal of division in our country. Now, a great deal of it need not have been made divisive, but we know that the previous administration, previous president used it as a real tool, to a political tool, and that has damaged the debate and the conversation about comprehensive immigration reform terribly, because it has split the public. And when you take on these very, very large issues, you need support from both sides. So I think that what you have presented is extraordinarily thoughtful. It really is. It's extraordinarily thoughtful. I haven't heard anyone make a presentation like yours and make the recommendation that you've made. Getting it done is a whole nother issue. But I do think in future discussions, proposals, debates on comprehensive immigration reform, that climate refugees is something that should be a part of that discussion and debate. It's extraordinarily thoughtful. I really salute you for what you took on in this. As I said, every presentation has taken on, each team, subcommittee, has taken on big, tough issues. Most frankly, if they were easy and it was low-hanging fruit, believe me, Congress would have done it already. It's the tough stuff that is, takes time. It depends on the politics in the country, the makeup of the Congress, and of course, leadership from the White House. So bravo to each one of you. Well, very well done. I don't have any questions.
Thank you.
Just the comment, yeah.
Next up, we have the Climate Tax Policy Subcommittee, made up of Nursham Low, Apurva Chakravarti, Madeline Wang, and Lucas Owen.
Thank you for the introduction, Akshay, and hello, Congresswoman Eshoo, as well as our other guests. My name is Lucas Owen, and I've had the privilege of being the chair of the Subcommittee on Climate Tax Policy. In today's presentation, we will be exploring our subcommittee's proposal that through the use of a federal cap-and-trade program in the United States, we can both decrease emissions and encourage a sustainable and necessary transition to clean energy for all Americans. We're first going to look at the problem of climate change, then some background, and finally the solution that we're proposing. Next slide.
Each year, the United States releases billions of tons of greenhouse gases into the air. This release of carbon dioxide greatly increases the greenhouse effect, contributing to global warming. And this warming can cause extreme weather events like storms, tornadoes, hurricanes, wildfires, severe droughts, and heat waves. Increased emissions can also cause respiratory illnesses in humans from the increased smog and air pollution. We can see the effects of climate change in melting polar ice caps, rising sea levels, disturbance of natural habitats, and extreme weather events. The primary issue is that recently our government has not taken many widespread, significant policy actions to incentivize companies to become more eco-friendly. It is necessary that we encourage change in the private sector in order to fight climate change. Next slide, please.
Now we're going to be looking at a bit of background. Next slide. There's a rich history of climate activism in the United States, starting in the 1970s and developing to today, where we've seen a lot of youth activism with icons such as Greta Thunberg. Climate change shifted from a scientific issue to a political concern in June of 1973 at the UN Conference on the Human Environment in Stockholm. This conference concluded that since climate change affects everyone, we need widespread reform, and further noted that climate change is as serious as nuclear war. Today, the US has had an ambiguous stance, one that shifts with each administration. For example, in 2015, we entered into the Paris Agreement, then left 2 years later, and now have re-entered it another 4 years later. Ultimately, there have been very few broad and consistent policies to encourage the private sector to fight climate change in the past. Next slide.
There have been many efforts in the past to pass carbon pricing bills, with most failing because of a lack of bipartisan support. Proposals for these carbon pricing bills started in the early 1990s, but bipartisan support for bills occurred during 2003 to 2008. However, from 2009 to 2018, these bills were proposed primarily by Democrats, and Republicans began opposing these bills heavily. Only recently, since 2018, has bipartisan support for carbon pricing bills arose again. The closest bill that has ever come close to passing was the Waxman-Markey Cap and Trade Bill proposed in 2009. This bill was also known as the American Clean Energy and Security Act. At its core, the bill sought to reduce emissions over the years 2012 to 2050 and would require corporations to be limited by the government to a number of allowances for emissions. And that number of allowances would steadily decrease, so emissions would fall over time. After the initial allowances were distributed, the companies were free to buy and sell allowances, and companies would face a higher cost as they emit more greenhouse gases. After much discussion, the bill passed in the House but was never considered for a vote in the Senate. The Biden administration has listed putting the world on a sustainable path by implementing strong environmental standards as one of their top priorities. Their goal is to promote renewable energy supply chains so that the United States achieves net zero global greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, a goal that our proposal reaches. The respective committee and subcommittee for our proposal would be the House Committee on Energy and Commerce and the Subcommittee on Environment and Climate Change. Next slide, please.
Next slide, please. Our proposal of a federal cap and trade program is largely based on the 2009 bill. Many of the components are the same, including the allowing of offsets and the long-term plan, which is reaching 58% of 2005 emissions levels by 2030 and 17% of 2005 emissions levels by 2050. One key difference is our revenue use. The revenue use of the 2009 bill changed in the percentage allotted towards each use every year. Key components included the refundable low-income energy tax credit, the energy rebate program, and climate projects. However, our bill will have a revenue use that has a constant percentage allotted towards each use every year. 60% will be towards a carbon dividend and 40% towards climate projects and R&D. Now I will pass it on to Madeline for the implementation steps.
Our cap and trade program, similar to the 2009 bill, would be overseen by the EPA and the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC. Both of these agencies have the administrative infrastructure necessary to oversee this program, though additional costs would be incurred when first implementing this program. However, over time, the program would end up paying for itself and more. Together, these two agencies would distribute new allowances each compliance period. Each compliance period would be 1 year long and would start on the first day of the month following the date the legislation was passed. For the first 15 years of the program, companies would each receive some free allowances, though most all allowances would be auctioned off. Additionally, companies would be allowed to trade allowances with one another, and a record of all trades would need to be accounted for, registered, and recorded with the EPA administrator overseeing the policy. The banking of allowances would also be permitted. Companies could bank allowances to use for future years during the first 9 months of each compliance period. Though if companies did not bank their allowances and still had some left over at the end of the compliance period, those leftover allowances would be void. Additionally, if a company were to emit more carbon than their allowances permitted for, they would be fined. Each year, the number of available allowances would decrease in accordance with a formula, which would be designed to meet and exceed major climate action goals. Something that would help in meeting these goals would be a required study that would be conducted every 4 years, with the findings of this study being reported to Congress. The results of this study would determine the GHGs included in the program and would adjust the formula to meet climate milestones. As mentioned before, our program would generate considerable revenue, which according to CBO estimates will be approximately $50 to $300 billion each year. As mentioned before, the revenue would both be used for climate research and development and distributed to the public. The 60% of revenue distributed to the public through a carbon dividend would be distributed according to a formula, which would allot more money to those with a lower income and those living in areas with higher energy prices. Essentially, revenues from fines and permit auctions would be recycled into the economy to ensure a sustainable low-carbon energy industry. Next, we will take a look at some similar successes. Next slide, please.
You may be wondering what a federal cap and trade program can actually do in the United States. Well, there's actually a fairly recent precedent for such a policy. During the 1990s, the United States implemented a federal cap and trade program in order to decrease the amount of pollutants that caused acid. By 2007, they saw a 43% reduction in the amount of pollutants, and they did this at a quarter of the estimated cost. We could also look to the EU with a 29% decrease in greenhouse gas emissions, or even our very own state of California, which reduced greenhouse gas emissions by 10% through a cap and trade program. I could also go on to list other examples in Mexico, China, or even the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which represents 10 states in America. But the takeaway is clear. A federal cap and trade program for greenhouse gas emissions represents a necessary and cost-effective component of any strategy to address climate change. Next slide.
Our proposal of a federal cap and trade program will provide market-based incentives for businesses to reduce emissions. And by providing a long-term timeline, businesses will have long-term certainty in order to invest in emissions reductions. And while our proposal results in significant reductions in emissions, it is not a silver bullet, but a necessary tool in a portfolio of climate policies. Thank you for your time, and I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's an excellent presentation. The legislation that you referenced back in 2009 that was passed in the House, you have no idea how tough that was to pass. I mean, it was hand-to-hand combat with members in terms of debate, you know, taking one member aside. I mean, the whipping was really fierce, and you had to have members that really understood the issue, so that if, you know, someone from coal country threw out their objection, you would need to know how to answer them. So I was really proud of the work that we did on that, and we passed it. It was singularly, as you said, singularly the most comprehensive climate energy legislation that had ever been passed by Congress. And then the Senate never took it up. Senate never took it up. So I think that you're on target with what not only you reviewed and put forward, but also you know, the recommendations, because there are significant reductions in emissions, which is what we need to do. We need to bend this curve. It's got to go in the other direction. So I think you've done a great job with this. You know, it really does matter who's elected. You ever hear any of your pals or relatives or whomever say, it doesn't make any difference, nothing's ever going to change? You know what? It does matter. It matters everywhere who is elected, what their values are, and what their views are, because it all comes down to a vote. It all comes down to votes. And if you can have the best idea in the world on fill in the blank, tell me how many votes you have. That's where the rubber meets the road. So this is where our problem is, the number of votes. So we need to build on what we have now so we can get these things over the finish line. I want to see it in my lifetime. You certainly want it done in your lifetime. You shouldn't have to inherit a mess. Okay, on to what? Transportation. The issue of the week, of the month, of the next 30 days, 60 days in Congress, transportation.
Yeah, our next subcommittee is transportation, with members Nitya Meramuthu, Hamza Rabini, Ryan Abbasi, and Satvik Amarvati.
Hello, my name is Nitya Meramuthu, and I am chair of the Transportation Subcommittee. And today we will be presenting our ambitious vision for high-speed rail in America. So I'll pass it on to Ryan for the background.
Thank you. And I'd like to begin by connecting and drawing the important connection between the transportation industry as a whole and also greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. So first off, you can see that the transportation industry plays a huge role in global CO2 emissions and other greenhouse gas emissions, which of course we know are responsible for climate change and catalyzing global warming. We also see that there's a large disparity in the percentage of long distance travel done by personal vehicles and used by public transport, which tends to be cleaner and more environmentally friendly. Thus, the most important and critical step to directly combat climate change is to reduce transport emissions and greenhouse gas emissions as a whole. And our subcommittee proposes a national railway system that connects multiple hubs throughout the United States to invest in a greener future and also bring back economic benefits to help slow down and help combat climate change. I'd like to now pass it on to my colleague Nitya to discuss the legislative proposal.
Thank you. So for reference, this is the current Amtrak map. As you can see, rail lines are concentrated in the Northeast with a few in the Midwest. This current Amtrak map will serve as a model for our nationwide plan, and we suggest building on top of pre-existing lines to make them high speed and adding more connections where there are significant commuter needs. So while a nationwide high-speed rail is the ultimate goal, we recognize that jumping that fast into a major transportation and infrastructure shift is just not economically feasible. Due to this, our plan focuses on first prioritizing the lines listed above, chosen based on commuter needs and gaps in the current Amtrak connection. Our plan would create Chicago as a hub connecting major Midwestern cities. And all of these proposed lines will use Amtrak Acela, the high-speed rail which already exists in the Northeast corridor. Acela can reach up to 220 miles per hour. It is 100% electric and it uses much less energy. I will now pass it on to Hamza for more.
Thanks, Nitya. So like Nitya said, Amtrak has already ordered some of these high-speed trains for the Northeast, but what we're looking at here is a nationwide expansion. And the scope of this project includes 3 major regions, and a high-speed rail would have specific and unique benefits for each region. So I'll start with the West Coast. Our plan would start by building a high-speed rail line between Los Angeles and Las Vegas, which is a high-demand trip made 50 million times annually, which is why we believe that it's a logical starting point. And this route alone would take 3 million cars off the road every year. And in the future, we would connect any Amtrak expansions to existing private projects like the California High-Speed Rail Project or the Cascadia Project, and we may also give funding to these projects. Now moving on, a high-speed rail in the Midwest would give over 40 million people unprecedented connection and accessibility to transport between the major metropolitan hubs, which studies have shown would create over 70,000 jobs and save millions of tons of carbon. And equally important is that it would have a positive economic impact on intermediate cities and stops in rural areas. And finally, with the Northeast, we believe the main impact would be giving people who work in large cities but might not be able to afford housing costs the ability to live in more residential areas and still have a quick commute to work. And this is true of the entire US. High-speed rail will give people the ability to choose where they want to live independently of where they work and give everyone shorter commutes and access to more affordable living costs outside of major cities. I'll pass it back to Nitya to talk about cost.
So with previous high-speed rails and infrastructure plans, the cost has been a great point of contention. So this is how our plan breaks down. The US HSR suggests a $1 trillion plan for high-speed rail. However, because we are using pre-existing lines and we will rely heavily on construction companies, we believe we can bring that cost down to $800 billion. Another point of reference would be the SF to LA high-speed rail, which amounted to about a little over $100 billion, which breaks down to 80 to 140 million per mile. But because of the different factors, we believe that 80 to 140 million per mile would be an overestimate for our nationwide system. With cost comes administration and oversight. So in terms of building, the Federal Railroad Administration would be in charge of inspecting pre-existing rails to see their viability for a high-speed rail upgrade. Once this is over, construction companies would take over completely for the building itself. In terms of funding, Congress would be funding about 80% of the project, and then the rest of the 20% will be funded by private companies who would involve themselves for potential profit or because they currently hold trains. And finally, all operations will be run by Amtrak. I'll pass it to Hamza for legislative considerations.
Thanks, Nitya. So we've seen that high-speed rail has historically been very popular among Democrats and is especially popular in the current Biden administration. But we've also taken the time to think about some of the main concerns Republicans and opponents would have and how we would mitigate those concerns. So one, of course, is eminent domain. In response to this, since we're primarily using existing rail lines, we don't think we would have much of an issue with this, and any land losses would reasonably be compensated by the government. Another concern we anticipate is fiscal responsibility, and we understand that this is a large budget we're allocating, but through the private-public partnerships we're creating with large federal oversight, we think we would be able to avoid the overspending that we've seen with other private projects. And finally, related to fiscal responsibility is demand itself, and we believe that since we've designed our routes specifically for commuter pathways, our high-speed rail network will be a very attractive option for those people. And finally, this is not meant to be a replacement for current infrastructure plans. We're simply picking up where current plans are leaving off, and we're looking decades into the future to build a robust nationwide transportation system that cements the US as a leader in climate change and creates long-term benefits across many domains. And we think by presenting this as a manufacturing and infrastructure-focused bill that addresses climate change while also creating economic growth and job opportunities, we'll be able to demonstrate its economic viability to opponents. I'll pass it back to Ryan to close out.
Thank you. And Congresswoman, we completely understand that this is very fresh and very bold legislation, but we'd like to reiterate that with that boldness and freshness of our proposal, there are also many fresh and bold benefits that we will get in turn. So this can be specifically seen in the areas of construction and operation, creating many new jobs in building the railroad in the first place, and in the years to come, maintaining jobs through the operation of the railroad system. We would also see many benefits in spurring economic growth in rural areas, which will profit and gain economic growth from the railroads by being connected to more urban hubs and also allowing for job growth in those areas that are so often left behind. I'd like to now pass it back to my colleague Nitya.
One important part of sustainable transport is also to address commute. And commute is important not only because it relates to job stability, upward mobility, and higher standard of living for all Americans, but also because we want to achieve that 1 mile goal, which means that public transportation is within the hands of every citizen. I'll pass it to Hamza for the next point.
Thanks, Nitya. So like we said before, we understand that this is a bold proposal, but we do believe that this is the future of transportation in America, and that our plan would give America a 21st century transportation system that would not only combat climate change, but would create thousands of long-lasting jobs and generate millions in economic impact across the country, both for big cities and small towns. We would open new housing markets to workers and spread economic growth to rural areas, all while cutting travel times for everyone. I'll pass it back to Ryan to close out.
Thank you. And we just like to reiterate the idea of building green to get green back in the future. So investing in a clean environment to combat climate change directly, and in turn receiving an economic growth as a result of this proposal. And we understand that it's bold, but again, with bold legislation comes bold benefits. Thank you. And we would love to address any comments or questions that you have, Congresswoman.
Well, this is, I love this presentation. Well, I mean, all of them are extraordinary, exceptional, visionary. And I love build green, get green. And I think that, it's so apparent that you get it. You really do get it. Under the very large umbrella of climate change, all of our transportation systems need to change. They have to be green, and rail is an enormous opportunity for the movement of commerce, as well as commute routes and all that's attached to it. Just to bring it down to a really local level, there were huge fights here on the peninsula about with the high-speed rail authority. The people of California approved what was on the ballot several years ago to build a high-speed rail system. And then there was a group that was put together after that passed. And it was, I think, really quite unfortunate the way they conducted themselves. They came down the peninsula and they said, this is what we're going to build and you better like it. Every single city, I think without exception, on the peninsula filed a lawsuit because of what they wanted to do. They wanted to tear up the communities, do 30, 40, 50 feet elevations of I don't know what. It was a classic case of how not to do something. How not to do something. The most classic case I've seen in my entire public office career. So, you know, in dealing with them, in listening to constituents, and seeing what the upset was, I came up with the following. I said, you know what? We can have our own high-speed rail system, and it's called Caltrain. That's the spine of our transportation system on the peninsula. We should invest in it. We should electrify it. We should get rid of the diesel that is dirty and slow, and have a much higher speed, have it be quieter, have it carry more people, and have it honor the communities that it moves through. And so I set about to secure the money for that, for the electrification. And it was a long haul. I was successful in securing about $700 million for the electrification. Worked hard on passing the proposals on the ballot in the 3 counties that are part of the Joint Powers Authority. They share authority: the City and County of San Francisco, the County of San Mateo, and the County of Santa Clara, to increase our sales tax, because what I secured for the electrification does not make up for the shortfalls at the you know, the box, you know, the fares that people pay. So I tell you this story because I think it's worth telling. There are many pitfalls in all of this. I think we need to think big. We need to think green, and rail definitely has to be a part of this huge infrastructure legislation that we're putting together. People love trains. They really do. And, you know, when you see the condition of our some of our rail stations, I mean, have you gotten off the train in New York and gone through the, oh my God, it's really, it's like a third world country. And it's embarrassing for our great country to be just chugging behind in every way. So this is, you know, someone said earlier that, you know, these challenges present enormous opportunities, and that's the best way to look at it. I mean, if we just, you know, turn our hands until they're, you know, as tight as a drum, and woe is us, and these are gigantic issues, and what are we going to do? There are opportunities, and there are real economic opportunities for the American people, because this is a huge jobs plan, and these are very good jobs, not only in manufacturing the equipment, and that's what I insisted on for Caltrain, that the trains be manufactured in the United States, that they would be American workers, and then of course American workers keeping the system up. So this is, when you say build green, you also say, you know, when you say get green and build green, there's a lot of green in it. You can see it right on the screen with these $100 bills. Boy, do those look real. They must be, huh? I don't know where you got that from, but it's quite a scream. So that's the local story. That's the local story. I think that we win. And to this day in polling throughout our region, Caltrain is something that is supported by the general public. They understand the benefit of it, and they certainly got behind the plan that I had put forward at the time. And I had to have every transportation agency sign off on it. So it wasn't easy to do, but they did buy into the plan that I had. And And if high-speed rail ever comes up to San Jose, then the Caltrain system can join with it. But meanwhile, we already had, I thought, the makings of our own high-speed rail. So I think it's a good story. And I really want to see this done nationally. So bravo to you. This is a great, great presentation. I loved it. I like Chicago being the hub too, the middle of our country.
Well, next we have the Agriculture Subcommittee, and that's comprised of Harsimran Chauhan, Emily Choi, Caitlin Devaney, Henry Donald, Emily Mustard, and Ava Wade.
Hello, my name is Caitlin Devaney, and I'm a part of the Agriculture Subcommittee, where we have chosen to focus on the development of sustainable agriculture and farming techniques that will assist in the fight of mitigating climate change. Next slide, please. Climate change is a very serious and immediate threat. The current agriculture system is a contributing factor through its excessive amount of greenhouse gas emissions during production and transportation. Next slide. The growing effects of climate change would also negatively impact the efficiency and productivity of the agricultural industry through extreme heat, changes in soil, and water stress, all factors caused by climate change. Next slide. Now, aquaponics is a more eco-friendly and sustainable alternative to traditional farming that we found to be effective both environmentally and economically. Aquaponics is a way of farming that uses waste produced by fish as nutrients for plants grown hydroponically or without soil. The plants provide clean water for the fish, and the fish waste is recycled and water is recirculated. Also, aquaponics uses up to 90% less water than traditional farming, and studies have shown that produce is grown up to 3 times faster. Next slide. We plan on implementing a 3-step approach to reach our goals of mitigating the negative effects of climate change affecting and caused by agriculture. Now I will pass it to Emily, where she will address the legislative background. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Caitlin. Fortunately, relevant programs already exist in the US to promote sustainable agriculture for large companies and local farms. Next, please. For instance, the Environmental Quality Incentive Program made by the USDA provides financial resources and technical assistance to the producers and water management companies that implement conservation practices. Through this program, the Natural Resources Conservation Service and producers invest in sustainable farming solutions and develop conservation practices that address water protection issues. Next, please. Another example is the Conservation Stewardship Program, which is also operated by the USDA. It creates tailored plans for farmers to identify natural resource problems in their operation field and provides help to address them through conservation efforts. Next, please. However, the aforementioned programs tend to focus on enhancing only common sustainable techniques, such as cover crops and prescribed grazing, although implementing aquaponics proves more beneficial. While common sustainable techniques such as cover crops help reduce soil loss and decrease water erosion, aquaponics does not involve the use of soil and once again utilizes 90% less water than traditional agriculture, thus almost completely avoiding soil loss and water erosion issues. With that, I will pass it over to Henry for our policy proposal.
Could you skip ahead 2 slides? Thank you. So the policy proposal we're presenting has 3 parts. Next slide, please. The first recommended solution is increase research funding for sustainable agriculture. This would be administered to innovative research institutions such as University of Texas A&M, which already has an agricultural research program, and will be used to further develop the efficiency and reduce costs of sustainable agricultural methods such as aquaponics, and we suggest about $20 million. We determined this would be a reasonable amount to be earmarked specifically for agricultural research and create a significant advancement in this technology. Could you move on, please? Thank you. The second prong is subsidies for carbon sequestration. As my partner mentioned, agriculture accounts for 10.5% of current carbon emissions, so we cannot wait until we have the infrastructure of sustainable agriculture to start investing in this technology. There already exists a great number of technologies to reduce carbon emissions from traditional agriculture, and we can promote those through subsidies. And we suggest about total $10 million in costs to begin. They can expand later as it gets more political buy-in. Our colleagues in the Biodiversity Subcommittee have already introduced a number of the potential solutions that we can subsidize and use agriculture as a carbon sink in the future. Could you move on to the next slide? The main policy proposal is the urban farm development. This is a joint operation run by the HUD and USDA and will address healthy food shortages in urban communities, as well as supply local jobs to residents. It will be run by about a $10 million fund that is distributed to about 5 farms to start that hopes to expand if the venture proves successful. It will drastically reduce emissions associated with agriculture by eliminating carbon emissions that result from transportation, as well as processing of grown foods. And it will be incredibly beneficial to those local communities that are in need of healthier foods. The program that is the main policy. We'd like to move on to the legislative analysis.
Thank you, Henry. Next slide, please. Democrats in both the House and Senate are in full support of proposals combating climate change. Some include David Scott, Kathy Castor, and Debbie Stabenow. Next slide, please. Even so, about 150 members of the United States 116th Congress did not believe in climate change. And accordingly, a significant majority of these 150 members were and are a part of the Republican Party. Now in the 117th Congress, there are still around 140 members who refuse to acknowledge the science behind climate change and its effects on society. Next slide, please. Those who are in initial disagreement with our proposal must reconsider that this newer form of agriculture will provide overall more nutritious food for the urban and rural populations of the United States and provide improved business opportunities that will allow the economy to grow and expand, especially for Republican states that depend on their agricultural economies. All in all, our proposal offers more nutritious food options, economic expansion opportunities, and overall growth of industry, all while fighting climate change. Next slide, please. Furthermore, initial deniers of our proposal must look at the technological and environmental benefits before coming to a decision. Vertical farming techniques provide less water usage, a higher yield of crops, and can be done almost anywhere. We will now be hearing from Harsimran for our conclusion.
Hi, we reiterate that the ongoing environmental crisis poses a significant threat to our future as a civilization and is perpetuated through the substantial amounts of greenhouse gas emissions of the agricultural industry. We believe that our proposed solution of funding aquaponic and vertical implementation, funding agricultural research that yields sustainable production, funding green farms, incentivizing companies to support sustainable methods, and promoting sequestration techniques as outlined above, will help address the current issue efficiently. Next slide, please. In addition, our proposal will potentially benefit other industries through the promotion of subsidies, creation of more jobs that benefit in-need communities, and ultimately grow the agriculture sector of the economy. Next slide, please. Consumers will be positively impacted as the access to nutritional food and vegetables will increase in undeserved communities. To conclude, as a large developed country, the United States has duties to contribute to global change, and the switch to sustainable methods of production in the agriculture industry is that step forward in combating the dangerous climate crisis. Next slide, please. Thank you very much for listening to our presentation.
All right, our final subcommittee. Oh, go ahead.
No, I just want to say bravo. I'm familiar with these operations and have, but because of the pandemic, I haven't been able to visit one of the key operations that's in South San Francisco, and I plan to do that. You didn't mention any of the UC schools in terms of research. And of course, California is a major contributor to the agricultural sector in our country. Did you just skip over it? Do we not have any UCs that have departments that are doing this some of this research?
We do have a number of UCs that are invested in agricultural research. I believe UC Davis has a good program, as well as Irvine.
It began as an ag school. In fact, there were people that used to make fun of it, that that it was the only thing they taught, and it's gone well past agriculture. But it was based in that when it first opened. So I want to make sure if we do grants that the University of California is a part of that. So excuse me for being so provincial, but California is a nation state. We know a lot about agriculture, and but there's a lot about our agriculture that needs to change. We have a water crisis, and then you listed out the other things. So bravo, that's terrific. Okay, on to public education. Last but not least, right?
Yep, our last subcommittee is public education with members Sanvi Aurora, Selena Chen, Sivan Kumar, Lily Mosley, Carlos Asuna, and Kamran Ostrom.
I'm Sanvi, and myself, along with my fellow committee members, as Nikki mentioned, are incredibly excited to present to you today about the glorious wheels of our public education system, school buses. Now, while the bane of our childhood, the magic school bus runs on magic and doesn't really need to worry about its environmental repercussions, supernatural school buses unfortunately don't exist in real life. And anyway, during a time when the Green New Deal is viewed as a form of imperialistic propaganda, and many seemingly remain unfazed about our impending sixth mass extinction, school buses are probably at the bottom of our concerns. However, the persistent issues that school buses continue to pose are not to be ignored and require urgent and immediate action, which is why our group is really excited to present on the importance and feasibility of electric school buses. Next slide, please. Why even bother with school buses? For one, they transport around 26 million students daily to and from school, making them a necessary component of our education system. And who doesn't love the iconic Magic School Bus songs that plagued our childhood with their unforgettably catchy lyrics, and also exuded an unbridled and, to be honest, almost unhealthy amount of cheeriness into the air? However, excessive joy isn't the only material that these brilliant yellow boxes with wheels have emitted into our atmosphere. In fact, school buses, as they currently operate, emit around 5.3 million tons of noxious gases into the atmosphere, an amount that is pretty comparable with the amount emitted by a little over 1 million cars. Due to these concerns, many have expressed support for alternative engines to power our current modes of transportation, including your everyday Joe, President Biden. But how? How are we just, oh, next slide, please. But yeah. How are we supposed to just change every single school bus in operation to adapt their engines to be more environmentally friendly? It's not like we're all magical beings who can somehow accomplish such an extraordinary feat, but we are. Next slide. 25th, 2021, in the House of Representatives, a bill was introduced to establish the Clean School Bus Grant Program and also a couple of other provisions. And then the bill was later referred to the Committee on Energy and Commerce. This bill was also known as HR 1344, or this Clean School Bus Act of 2021. This bill is pretty amazing. Next slide. Now, this bill just magically fell into our laps during our quest for a feasible mechanism to meet our goals. Not only does it include provisions to replace certain diesel buses with electric engines, it also installs appropriate infrastructure to support the sustained operation of electric buses over a longer period of time. It also subsidizes development and training to ensure the safety and feasibility of the project in the long term, and includes provisions for technical planning to ensure a smooth transition to electric engines. The current version of the bill isn't all that bad. Not only does the legislation incentivize schools to purchase cleaner transportation alternatives, it also includes economic benefits writ large as it supports domestic investment and ensures that the disposal of engines is properly and responsibly taken care of. The bill also includes worker protections by making it harder for companies to lay off workers arbitrarily, which gives the bill widespread support in that regard as well. I'll pass it over to Selena to talk about the rest.
If the solution was easy, then the problem would have already been solved. That is unfortunately not the case, as there are quite a few things that need to be fixed with the bill that we will address in this presentation. Next slide, please. Let's make this a little interactive and play a little guessing game. What is the price of an electric bus? Feel free to drop your guesses in the chat and please don't Google it. I know we've received enough lectures this year on academic integrity. Good guess, good guess. Next slide, please. It seems that most of the guesses are actually a bit low. Shockingly, you can see the respective cost on this slide, and an electric bus is more than double the price of a diesel bus. In fact, it's the same price as a Lamborghini. Next, please. And that's the problem with the bill. By granting schools around $120,000 per bus, it expects schools to pay the difference in price between an electric bus and a diesel one. It relies on the school's ability to purchase new buses, ignoring the fact that schools can't even afford the initial price of a diesel bus. This is exemplified by the case of Elko County. Next, please. In Elko County, more than half of the bus fleet is older than standard, and the transportation supervisor reports that a bus breaks down almost every week. These outdated vehicles not only create logistical problems, but also endanger the lives of children. Next, please. We can remedy this issue of outdated school buses and protect our environment at the same time by either having the bill cover the whole cost of electric vehicles or a larger fraction of the cost. Next, please, and I'll be passing it on to Lily.
On the topic of money, could you please? Okay, well, on the topic of money, the award amount is not exactly Scrooge McDuck's fault. $2 million is not a lot. If a school district had 8 schools, they would not be able to fully electrify their school bus fleet using only the grant money to purchase school buses. And on average, schools districts in California have a lot more than just 8 schools. Next slide, please. So the solution, expand the amount that the grant awards, but perhaps in later years. 2 million is a great place to start, but hopefully in the later years, as we're seeing this grant succeed and bring change, we can maybe increase that award amount. And one place we might be able to get it from is the Space Force, since it's kind of a space farce now. Next slide, please. So our final kind of big grievance about this bill is that the way that it cuts out some of the target demographic. Next slide, please. We can see this in section 2B3CII. And I know this is a lot of text on one slide, but essentially it says that the secretary can use whether or not environmental action was taken before applying for a grant as criterion for getting the grant. And we really, really like how this incentivizes schools to put forward an effort and show that they care about the environment and not rely completely on the grant or the government's money. But we do want this bill to pass, and we know that typically states that are willing to implement more environmental policies are of one party. And by showing preference to them, not only will this make it harder for this bill to get bipartisan support, but it also might be cutting out a portion of our target demographic. Next slide, please. And I know that we covered a lot of the negatives of this bill during this presentation, but it's important that we focus on what this bill would accomplish if we were to get co-sponsored and voted on in the House of Representatives. It will provide an easier way for schools to get a new and improved bus fleet that is electric, that will be benefiting our environment and our students nationwide. And it would help actually protect the jobs of school bus workers, and it will help just electrify our country. And final slide, I suppose.
So thank you. Any questions?
Okay. Well, I loved this presentation as well. As I said, last but not least, education. Look, these school buses are long past their lifetime of service, and these buses really need to be retired. First of all, they're not safe. They don't even have seat belts. They don't even have seat belts. And, you know, they're spewing emissions. We love the look. I think that we can come up with, American manufacturers can come up with an all-electric yellow school bus that will be an icon in the 21st century. I think that in terms of grants for this, and I'm glad that you pointed out that there are shortcomings in the bill relative to you know, the dollars that would be available and then what the need is. What we're really looking at is the replacement of the fleet in our country. We're looking at a replacement, just as we need to replace the fleet of old post office delivery mail trucks. I mean, they're on their last leg, and we need, again, an all-electric fleet. For school districts, and as you said, there are many schools in a given school district. I think it should depend on what the average income of the students and their families are. So you have a larger grant because they are less able to afford to replace their fleet. So maybe there would be a 2/3, 1/3, 2/3 federal government and 1/3. I mean, you can adjust these amounts, but I think in school districts that can afford to do more, the federal government should still be a partner, but we don't have to do as much because there's an affordability factor. So that can be worked out. So I think you did a great job with this. I love it, and it's oh so practical. And you know, there's a significant amount of emissions coming from these school buses that you've indicated. So this is really an important area. Is that bill already introduced in the Congress?
Yes, it was introduced in February.
In February? Okay. All right. Well, what I want to say about legislation that you've asked me to co-sponsor, we'll review all of your proposals and get back to you on the bills. Okay. I have a bad habit. I read things, so I need to look at the bills. I trust your judgment, but sometimes you find things in bills that you find onerous. You never like them 100%. There's no such thing. There's nothing is perfect. It's all drawn up by human beings. None of us are perfect. So let me just make a couple of closing comments. First of all, bravo, congratulations. I mean, what you have done is nothing short of extraordinary in the content, in the vision that's contained in the content, and then the research that led you to make the proposals that you did. They're all innovative. They're very, very well thought out. I think just about all of them are exactly the kinds of policies that we need if we're going to really be successful in addressing climate change. So I'm going to take your ideas with me to Washington. I'm going to review what you've asked me to co-sponsor. I think some of them haven't been reintroduced in the new Congress yet, but I'll circle back with you and give you a report of exactly what I will do with, you know, making really these are advancements for the United States, but they will advance the world case relative to climate change. And I also, your report, as I said, I'm going to submit to the Library of Congress, and it will be cataloged there. And that should be a great source of pride to each one of you. It is to me. My hope is that your time on the Student Advisory Board has really given you new knowledge, tools, connections to other people, to be change makers. And I hope that the experience has been an enriching one for each one of you. You know what? We can never stop learning. We can never stop learning. And so you've done a great deal of learning, but you've also done a great deal of teaching to all of us today. And for that, I am not only deeply grateful, but I am exceedingly proud of each one of you. There are many people that talk about what is going to become of us as a country. What about our future? And what I never fail to say is, I wish you could hear the students that bring forward their proposals from the Student Advisory Board in our congressional district. You would have great confidence that our country is going to be in good hands because you're the future leaders of our country. And you know, I never fail to recognize that as you have shaped your proposals based on the research that you presented to us, that that built into these proposals are great values. They are great values. Respecting the dignity of every human being, that we are in charge of our collective future, that we are the stewards of the environment, and that every generation has to work very hard to turn over to the next generation improvements, and that you take it from there. I fear that's not the case from the present generation to your generation, unless we do what you're recommending to us. So, you know, I think that beyond your formal education, which is so important, that this experience, I hope, has been a very rich one. I think you've enriched all of us with your thinking. And as you've enriched us, you've inspired us. You sure have inspired me. You're a great source of inspiration to me. So stay curious, follow your passions, hear other people out on their ideas. Don't jump in the middle of it. Got to listen. Sometimes we just can't wait to say what we think, but hear them out. And that's, you know, that's what we have to do as a country so that we can build consensus. I want to thank everyone that joined us today. I don't know how many are left in terms of our audience, but for each person that joined us, thank you. For those that stayed with us for the entirety of it, bravo and thank you to each one of you. And to this year's class, especially those that are graduating, I wish you just every wonderful thing for you in your lives. And I want you to know that that the office will always, as long as I'm around, will be a resource to you. And any way we can help you, you call us, you let us know, and we'll have your back. We're right there with you. So bravo to all of you. Bravo, I couldn't mean it more. I'm so proud. What a presentation, my God. Excellent, excellent, excellent. Okay, so we're gonna sign off. Thank you to the great staff, my great staff who work so beautifully with you. And who knows, maybe one of these days you'll be part of the congressional staff too. So goodbye, all of my best, and bravo.